fine.
Oh, I think it was horrible, but thank you for.
I've heard worse, put it that way. That's why people just refer to me as Larry.
But at least we can call you Larry, right?
Yeah, yeah.
You are a guest lecturer for today. And normally we have a class of 10 people, so I expect others will join very soon. But if you want, you can start and tell us what you're going to teach us today.
Okay, so hello everyone. Good evening, morning, afternoon. I was asked to present or to initiate a conversation around migration, whatever that means, right? So hopefully we're going to delineate what this applies or how it's applicable to the African diaspora, people of African descent in the West, as well as in Africa in itself, and what the current or contemporary understanding is within the global North and the different patterns of migration we see from Africa and historical patterns as well as contemporary patterns. And I'm hoping to have an interactive conversation, so I'll be asking questions. I know there's only a couple right now, so I'm sorry to put this on you, but in order for us to have a more dynamic event, I like to keep as interactive as possible and for people to ask questions as we go along and not just simply wait until the end of any presentation. There are a number of themes that I will talk about, generally trying to offer, like I said, the delineation of the process and what the distinctions are when we talk about migration and other forms of people movement. I want to put it like that, right? A movement of people, the geography of migration or movement. Hello?
Yes, Larry, we can hear you.
Okay, so I'm not sure whether you want me to just start right now.
Yes, you can start right now. And if you usually when you want us to also ask you questions or say something, you can just point out
indicate. Okay.
Yeah, just pick out one of the names there.
Okay, so thank you all for giving me this opportunity to have this conversation with you. It was a last minute thing. I was asked to step in based on my experience of working with migration in Europe. So just to give you my background, my name is Olanrewaju Olamofe. I'm a British-born Nigerian from the UK, living in Poland, Warsaw, Poland, and I am currently the executive director and co-founder of an NGO called PADLink, People of African Descent Link, working across the diaspora. So doing work in Africa, doing work here in Europe, in the Americas, and hopefully in Latin America at some point, and Asia, addressing some of the issues pertaining to people of African descent around racism, discrimination, and hostility towards just being Black, right? Being Black and present. I was a former diplomat. I am a former diplomat. I used to work for an organization based here in Poland, which is why an intergovernmental organization called the Organization for Security and Cooperation, which is what brought me here in the first place in 2009. I was the deputy head of the Tolerance and Non-Discrimination Department, again, focusing on hate crime and issues pertaining to discrimination, not just against people of African descent, but all people. But prior to that, my work was in migration in Hungary as a consultant and a lecturer on a number of these things. And so I have a deep knowledge of at least the patterns of migration to Europe, actually from Africa. And this is why the organizers reached out to me yesterday to ask if I could stand in or step in today. Can we have just a brief introduction of the people present? And as we're doing that, could they also say at least one of the things that they're expecting to get from this session? So can I go to Saskia? Great name, by the way.
Hi, my name is Saskia Meiland. I'm a teacher of history on secondary level, high school. And I haven't participated the last week because I was in the hospital. I had the operation on my lungs, so I
Also,
haven't been able to prepare for tonight. I would like to know more about African history and the perspective of Africa on a lot of things, a lot of topics. And I also like it that I'm getting classes from African historians and professors and scholars, because I haven't got I was educated in Suriname and in Holland, and I also got African history, but it's from a Surinamese perspective and a Eurocentric perspective, and it's fine to now get it from the mouth of the horse.
well, thank you for that, and I hope
Yes,
that you had this. The operation was successful.
yes, thank
Okay,
you.
happy to be here. Kenneth, please.
Hi, good afternoon, evening, actually, and good afternoon for you. Let me see my camera. Yes, that's look better. Yes, my name is Kenneth. I was born in Suriname. I grew up in the Netherlands. I still live in the Netherlands. That's also where I do my work. My profession is actually, I am graduated in mathematics and computer science, and that's also where I found my employment. Next to that, I'm a volunteer in a number of organizations here in the Netherlands. One is that's a radio host for a local radio station. I do talk a lot about the people of African descent. The organization I am the chairman of is called Foundation for Afro-Caribbean Way of Life and Spirituality. And for that organization, I make a couple of times a week, couple of hours a week, a radio show, and we talk about stuff like history, racism, decolonial material. I'm very much self-educated on the topic of African history and decolonial politics, etc. And I do enjoy to participate in such a forum as this, where you have different scholars and different activists from the African diaspora exchanging their ideas. So I also look forward very much to your lecture today, Larry.
Thank you very much. Pleased to meet you as well, and commend the work you're doing. And then lastly, let me hope I get the name correctly, Rubian. Hello, is Rubian present? Okay. All right. Okay. So thank you for joining, Rubian, even though you're not in the most optimal situations and scenarios to participate. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for your introductions and also for outlining exactly what it is that you're hoping to get from this exchange. There's something that Kenneth said that resonated with me, and it's something I hear when I do the work I do generally. And also something you said, Saskia, as well. I mean, Eurocentric, right? But Kenneth didn't say that. He said something else. But the two of them actually, in a sense, represents why what we're doing today is quite an important event for us as Black folk, people of African descent from the diaspora. I grew up in the UK, and you've grown up in different countries, actually. And the one thing that connects our experience, and I don't know whether it's the same thing for you, Rubian, but anyway, I'm just taking it for granted that it is that we get our knowledge from a Eurocentric white perspective, right? And so when we hear about or read about Africa, we always see it from a negative perspective, or a subservient perspective. And so we're always trying to combat that knowledge, that system of knowledge that informs how we perceive ourselves in any reality. And what you said earlier, Kenneth, I will make a reference to, is that in order to combat it, we tend to have to self-educate because the knowledge is not readily available. And this is a challenge that we face. And it's, you know, and when we talk about the matters of migration, it's very axiomatic or central to our perception of ourselves because we're always perceived as outsiders, right? Oh, do I have to admit? So we're always perceived as outsiders and we always feel as if we're illegitimate or we're delegitimized, right? And that is always the challenge that we face in terms of pushing for our rights and access to opportunities that are denied us because of this racist superstructure. And we have to understand that that racist superstructure was underpinned in slavery and in colonialism. So when we talk about decolonizing spaces, I didn't realize I was at the host. When we talk about these things, we also have to understand that we have to unpack that history that put us in these positions in the first place. So moving into the presentation directly, I have a question for the group. When you hear migration, what comes to mind? Especially because I know I'm not sure where everybody is, but at least 2 European people based in Europe and the Netherlands may have a particular understanding of that. But what do you think, or what springs to mind when you hear migration? I can tell you, when I hear migration, I see it as a synonym for undermining or being racist against our folk, right? So when you hear migration, what springs to mind? Anyone?
Yeah, Larry, I would like to respond.
Okay, please do.
I'm not sure if I missed the introduction round, but I think you skipped me.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I
Okay.
didn't know that you were still available. Sorry for that. So please do introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Lisbeth Chonameo. I'm Surinamese. My parents are both of my parents are from Suriname, but I was born and raised in Holland. And since a decade now, I've been living in Ghana and I'm teaching here at the university and I'm running a radio studio. So to answer that question about migration, what pops into my mind is movement. And our family history is very much dominated by movement. And I'm not only talking about the transatlantic slave trade, I'm also talking about the movement for both of my parents individually from each other to decide to leave Suriname and to go to Holland and stay there and have their family there. And then now me deciding to move from Holland and come and stay here in Ghana. And I got a lot of questions about that. And a lot of people didn't understand, but with the years, and a lot of people have visited me, but I'm basically the only person from my family who has ever made a step like that. So for me, I see it as my migration from Holland to Ghana for me is the extension, is coming out of the migration that my parents did from going to Suriname to Holland. And their migrations, of course, also linked to what our ancestors have done, moving away from West Africa, shipped away from West Africa, and then taken to the Americas. So that's how I see migration, really movement of our family. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And sorry for overlooking you in the introductory phase. I didn't realize that you were participating in this way. Okay, so thank you for that. And so you mentioned taken. I would like to come back to that at some point, right? And yeah, I'm trying not to get into the substance right now. I just want to have like this conversation to shape and frame the presentation. So anyone else, when you hear migration, what does it spring to mind for you? Saskia?
Yeah, when I think about migration, my mother came to Holland when she was 21 years. She stayed here for 4 or 5 years and then came back to Suriname. And I came here when I was 24 years. I stayed here for 8 years. Then I went back to Suriname with my 2 sons. And then I came back here with my 2 sons after 4.5 years. So migration is for me when I look at my own life and I think about it, I think migration is you don't belong anywhere else anymore. Because I love Suriname, I have a house there, I go there every year on vacation. But every year when I go there and on vacation, I think like it feels like I'm looking like an outsider now. And when I live in Europe now, and I love it here. I also, but I'm also not a European. When people look at me, they don't see a Dutch person. They don't see, although that I have a Dutch passport, I have a sense of not belonging anywhere anymore. Although I love Holland, I love Suriname, but it's like I'm looking through the glass to both countries and both continents. It's
Okay,
like
so
I'm looking like an outsider. I don't belong anywhere anymore.
okay. I mean, thank you for that. That's kind of leading us to where I was hoping we'd get to
That's
as well.
what comes to mind when I think about migration.
Thank you. So have you heard of the concept of double consciousness by Paul Gilroy, W.E.B. Du Bois? W.E.B. Du Bois in 1898 wrote a book called The Souls of Black Folk, and it's pertaining to the post-slavery, the immediate post-slavery phase and the Reconstruction phase in America after the Civil War. And he basically said that the question for the 20th century, so at the time, 1898 was turning into the 1900s, was the question of the color line and the notion of double consciousness. And I will come back to that, actually, because it's very, very important concept at a philosophical or social philosophical level, but also at an existential level. Because the question I have for you now, Saskia, sorry to put you on the spot, is, so do you feel home anywhere?
Yes. When I no the first 8 years when I was in Holland,
But I
I
mean
was
now,
home. Yeah. Yes, I love it here, and
but
every.
would you could consider it to be home?
Mm, mm,
Because that again leads me,
yes,
I was going
because
to
for the
ask the question.
meantime, I consider it home. But
Okay,
I'm thinking about when I get older, I feel like a machine here in Europe. I
okay.
have to work the whole day. Everything is so expensive. So I'm always mesmerizing about a life where I don't have to work so hard, like it was in Suriname. But every
Okay.
year when I go to Suriname, I see how hard it's becoming there, economic. Then I think, oh my God, where do I?
So then we have to hold on to another concept that you're leading to, which is romanticism, right? The romanticism of home,
Yeah.
right? Of where we're from. And this is the question I wanted to ask Elizabeth, which is, because you're not the first person I've heard from Europe who's gone back as an African descendant to Africa and settled in Ghana. So why Ghana out of all of Africa? So that's a question for later, right?
Oh
But
my
I'm
God.
still, sorry. So yeah, please
Don't
trust me.
believe this.
We're talking
Yes.
about similar experiences, actually, if truth is told.
No, the funny thing is, I just wrote this in a presentation. Why Ghana? Because I get that question a lot. And I just wrote it. And you're just saying it right now, just like 1 minute ago. Anyway,
So can
what is your question now for me?
No, so I'm just saying, I'm making a reference to your point that we will come back to that
Okay,
because,
sure.
it's something that it's connected to the conversation I was having just now with Saskia about home. I see other people have joined, so could you please quickly introduce yourselves and in a sense tell us what your expectations are from this event? And we're talking about right now the question of what is migration for us when we hear the phrase migration. So, Lashanda, Marcel.
Sorry, hello?
Hello.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm a little bit distracted with some work thing. I'm not fully in just yet.
Okay. But okay, so then just a brief introduction.
Oh, okay. Sorry, let me turn on my mic. Okay, so my name is Lachanda. I'm actually based in Brooklyn, New York. My parents are both from Suriname. Um, they came to New York in the 80s. I was raised here. I briefly stayed in not Suriname, in Holland for like a year or two when I was younger. I am a social worker. I do psychotherapy. And I realized the first time I realized I didn't really know much, it was when I actually went to a predominantly white institution. I didn't realize I didn't like, I was so used to being around people that look like me, and I didn't really see how much of like what the real world was. And once I realized what that really looked like, it made me like think about myself and want to learn more about my heritage and where I came from. So this is a part of one stop on a journey that I feel like it's going to be a long one. So that's why I'm in this course.
Okay, thank you. So one other question is that you say you work in psychotherapy or psychology. Who are your main clients in this? Is it amongst Black folk or just generally the public?
So I try to focus my area on perinatal mental health in the communities of color. So perinatal would be any from time of conception or building of relationships to conceive up until the child is 2 years old. So just that really early stage of family building. That's where I like to focus, and then I also like to focus on women's issues, like with Black women as well.
Okay.
So, do I get other clients? Yes, but my main focus has
Yeah.
primarily been women of color. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for that. So Maureen. Hello, Maureen. You present?
Yeah, good evening. My name is Maureen. I am living here in Holland for 53 years. Came here since I was 10. My mom came in the 60s. My father was here in the 40s, fighting during the war, the Second War. What does migration mean for me? It's not only that we move from country to country, but also something about the government, the way the revenues, the problems that we have right now, so many years is part of it. And for me, it's not how to say it is not in balance, because the way white people go to all the other countries, they also migrate, but the structure, the policy is more simple for them than for all the other ones. And there are more things in common why this structure is for me not a right thing, the way it moves in general globally. Me myself, I am a cultural and social entrepreneur. I create mostly projects as a form to create transition, mostly for our young people, the ones who are here, born here, or their parents even are born here. I try to create transition that they know more about who they are by culture, by philosophy, about all the things that is Black. And I also like to create a transition in our policies with my projects.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, and the political dimension of migration will be discussed as well at some point in this conversation. So thank you for that. And then finally, Letitia. Hello, Letitia.
Yes, good afternoon. How are you?
Good afternoon. So could you just briefly introduce yourself and tell us as a group what you think about when you hear migration?
Thinking about migration, I see migration just like my previous classmates said. I see it like people moving from the one country to the other country, and sometimes the one will stay in the other country or going back to his country because of some circumstances he didn't thought about before leaving her own country. And migration has many forms. Like the reason you move from the one to the other country, it can be economical, it can be studying or something else. And yes, that's it. That's it.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I mean, yeah, it's so everything that everybody has said is true. But I would like to make a distinction.
Larry,
Sorry.
can I, yeah,
Yes, sorry.
can I tell a quick, short
Yeah.
personal story?
Oh, please do.
Very funny, actually, because I was born in Suriname, but I came very young to the Netherlands. I think I was like 3 or 4 years old. And all the time when I was in the Netherlands, people would ask me, it was in the early 70s, when are you going back? When are you going back? So when I was like 20 something, it was the first time I went to visit my country of birth, Suriname. And when I was there during the visit, people were also asking me, when are you going back? But then I meant back to the Netherlands. Like, you are now already a stranger here. So when are you going back? You can see you're only there for a holiday. And then later on, for my work, I went to the Gambia. And actually what happened there was, they were like, oh, you are from here? Because they started to talk Wolof to me. I didn't understand. And also, when I was then hanging around somewhere, talking to people, also you had, how you call it, European women looking for friends on the beach. And they also thought I was from the Gambia. So at that point, I was like, this is really strange. So everybody in Europe are asking me, when are you going away from this country? I went to travel to Suriname. They were asking me the same. And I went in the Gambia. People were like, you do belong here. So it was like a really, so the people from the outside, when you talk about migration, they look at you and also they have some thoughts about you. Well, you think about your own situation in a very different way at that moment. So I thought I like to share that kind of personal thing, what happened to myself on this topic.
Thank you, Kenneth. I mean, thank you for sharing. And in a sense, it alludes or refers back to the conversation I was having with Saskia about double consciousness, right? And there's a phrase we use, which is being inside and outside at the same time. So a lot of your stories resonate with me because I've had personal histories similar to this. Being born in the UK, second generation immigrant from Nigeria, in London during the racist times of the 70s, being told to go back home, leave our country, blah, 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 where you from? When you say you're British, they say, no, before that. And I say, well, I was born in London. And they say, well, before that, you know, as if there was like a pre-season or pre-stage to my existence, right? Almost like a spiritual moment. And then I go to Nigeria and I speak with this London accent and they say, oh, well, you're not from Nigeria because you're an outsider, right? So this is why I asked the question about home for Saskia, right? Is that, are we trying to find our moorings and centering ourselves in a particular space that is completely, in a sense, unattainable? And the only place, so for me, when people ask me, where do you feel at home? I say New York. So I did my PhD in America and I lived in Bed-Stuy and I studied at the New School. And I felt much more at home there because it was so syncretic and, you know, people came from different backgrounds, you know, so you go to a particular part of New York, you get one community, you go to another part, blah, blah. So you do see that ethnic or racial divide, but then at the same time, you don't have what I consider to be the underlying hostility. You see it now because of Trump, but you don't really, when I was in America, you didn't really feel it. So even though I'm from London, I don't think I'm from London, right? And that actually informed my PhD at the time, and I came up with a concept called cosmodernity, talking about cosmopolitanism and modernity conflating together to create these new cultural meanings and identities and everything, because this is what syncretism has happened because of migration writ large. And so migration is such a heavy phrase. That's why I wanted us to unpack it, because I want to hold on to what Saskia said, I think earlier, about being taken. Because the next question is this: would you consider chattel slavery or the slave trade as a form of migration? Because a lot of our peoples, especially in the Northwestern Hemisphere and some of the global, the Southwestern Hemisphere, were taken from their homelands to that part of the world. Because I had this conversation recently, and I think it's important that we make these distinctions. So when we talk about how we've ended up in this particular part of Europe, at least from my perspective, and listening to your own personal histories about how your parents came and then you stayed, yada, 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 yada. and then we talk about us being transient and itinerant, at least there's one component here that's very, very powerful and very important to pay attention to: our agency. Our parents had the agency to decide whether they would like to embark on this journey or not. Sometimes you get the push and pull factors of the superstructure in terms of economic desire or economic needs, but then at the same time, you also have the need, like as I think it was Letitia and Maureen who mentioned, going to study. My parents went to study and I was born there. But the big difference between being born in a particular place and being a migrant or itinerant in that particular place is the time span. It's always like a temporary thing. There's a temporality about it, right? So just think about how we get visas today. They give you a visa for a fixed period. So my visa to America was for a fixed period, and once the studies were done, boom, I had to leave. However, back in the day, in the 60s and 70s, you could have families and you had family reunions, right? Reunification programs, which have now been, much more problematized. So there was a particular institutional and formal process that allowed us to settle in ways that you don't see today. So I hear what Letitia says and what Maureen said about the political nature of how they perceive refugees and migrants today. And I consciously use the phrase refugees because it's a way of pushing us out and delegitimizing us in terms of our claims for being in that territory, right? So I want us to pay attention and to ask that question. When we talk about slavery, do you consider that to be a form of migration? Elizabeth.
Yes, thank you.
Hello. You've dropped off.
Oh, sorry. I thought I had switched on my microphone, but I actually turned it off.
Turn it off, yeah.
So I've heard of the term forced migration. That's the term that they use here at the university here in Accra. So chattel slavery is a form of forced migration, and yeah. So I think I agree with that. That it's indeed a form of migration, but it's of course one that is not voluntarily.
Okay, so does anyone see a danger in making that conjugated phrase, forced migration? Bearing in mind, especially those in America right now, who understand that the way that they're trying to reevaluate or revise the history or the narrative of slavery is to insist or imply that slavery was a form of migration, which then brings in some of those elements that we talked about in terms of agency of deciding that we could go, right? And that there are benefits connected to it. So we're seeking a better life. So you look at what's happening in Florida and the educational system there, where they're now revising slavery to say it was actually a form of personal development for people, or those, this is why I think it's an important conversation to be had, right? Because you see, and that's why I said this is the danger of people like Donald Trump, who are opinion formers and leaders and exploit that particular discourse. So the reason I say this is because I don't think it is a form of migration from a legalistic point of view, right? If you force somebody to go somewhere, then it's a very different thing, just by what initiates it, the instigator, okay? So I am waiting to and soliciting and taking in other opinions on this before explaining further why I think this.
I have a question, because when you think, and I don't know if I'm like further like adding to that narrative, which I don't want to, but it's the idea like after slavery was done, right? And then we have generations later, and there are some of us who don't even want to go back to the continent at all. So it's like it looks like we almost like, yeah, this was done to us, but we're also not trying to go back, or we're also not trying to have any relationship with the continent, and that is all engineered socially with certain narratives that have been put out there. It's almost like Stockholm's in a sense, because we also at the same time it's like so bad that we don't even want to go back.
I would take it a stage further though. Is your name Lashanda, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll take it even further. The narrative has been embedded in us as folk that we also look at Africa as a place we don't want to go back to. right? In terms of our consciousness, because we believe that white supremacist language and narrative and framework that Africa is an undeveloped, backward, corrupt place, right? And that's the narrative that kind of the discourse that, you know, many Black folk appreciate, even in Africa, right? Which is the perversity of it all. Okay, because you think of when I'm off to Uganda again next week. I was there earlier this year, and I go to Kenya to do this work, and West Africa, and you hear these tropes being repeated that the white place, the West, is this manna, this heaven, this place that's aspiration that we can always do, and that's why people still want to go to the West, dying en route, walking across the Sahara. Every time I fly over Africa, going from north to south, I just look at that vast expanse of yellow, which is the desert. And knowing that people are walking and taking that hazardous route to find a life of betterment in the West. That mythology is so embedded that we are now victimizing ourselves with it, right? So this is why I said I'll take it even a phase further or a stage further, which is why we need to counter these narratives. But the other thing that I say, because you're absolutely correct, it may not simply be Stockholm Syndrome, but it alludes to what I said earlier about the temporality of migration. You go for a fixed period, you always have an ambition to go back, even if not to resettle. But, you know, many people have migrated to the West and come back to Africa or from their origins, right? And then they make a better life for themselves, got scholarships and then get a good job and end up in government, blah, blah. And there's a book by Carl Phillips. It's an old book, and he's a Caribbean writer. And he wrote, it's called The State of Independence. And he talks about 3 friends who were on this particular Caribbean island. And then one of them got a scholarship to go home, go abroad, and then ended up staying because he married a white lady, then had family, so he had to stay. And then went back after 20 years or so to see his other 2 friends who were now in the government, you know, and having some kind of like input and influence on the local social and political scenario. And the question was, well, actually, did going to the UK because he became a taxi driver or some sort, nothing really special, actually hinder his opportunities in terms of his destiny, because he ended up doing in a worse off situation than his counterparts who stayed. And I like that text because it actually challenges this whole notion of what the post-colonial cultures and practices and ideologies were. And it challenges the supremacy or the notion that going to the West is in our best interest. So this is why I asked the question about, do we perceive or understand slavery or forced migration as similar to migration? I say there's a qualitative difference between them, right? So I would say, and a lot of people, from a legalistic point of view, anyway, when you challenge slavery and you consider it to be a crime against humanity, we have to look at it as an earlier form of people trafficking, right? That you go to a particular place and you traffic people against their will to another place. And that's where the violence and the crime and the harm is and the injustice. The fact that consequently, decades or centuries later, that we have Black communities in these places who are settled to some extent, you know, doesn't actually make a difference in terms of making it translate or a transition from a form of trafficking to migration. That's a consequence, really, of being forced, and therefore, because we're humans and we have offsprings and different and subsequent generations who are now members of that local space, doesn't take away or detract from the fact that the original catalyst was a form of abduction and abuse. And so they're treated differently through the legal system. And this is why I say again that we need to try and make that distinction, because I do see that pernicious aspect of trying to say that slavery was a form of migration or a form of forced migration, is to actually diminish the harm. Because you have people trafficking in Europe today, right? White people trafficking. And people will never consider that to be a form of forced migration. Never. But when it comes to us, they try to minimize that experience in a way to delegitimize our claims, especially the claims for reparations, right? Because in the end, they would say, well, look, you know, we took you from the bush. Okay, you didn't want to come, but now look at where you are today. If you were still stuck in the bush, but you don't want to go back to, by the way, right? And so that's the logic and the pernicious logic of such a narrative. And I have these conversations with people, not to, in a way, to dismiss or to undermine their perceptions of slavery, because they may even have a much more linear and closer connection to slavery than me. I mean, for me, my overarching historical framework is colonialism, right? And the harms that was meted out to our people on the territory, which generates another conversation, which I think we'll get into, because I know Kenneth was talking about decolonization as well as some of the others too, right? So this is why I think it was important, and I sought out a couple of definitions, just so please bear with me, right? So this is a definition, it's a general definition of migration. Human migration is the movement of people from one place to another, things we've talked about earlier, with intentions of settling permanently or temporarily at a new location. So there's an intention to settle or not to settle, but we still are agency to do so, our free will. The movement often occurs over long distances and from one country to another, but internal migration is the dominant form of human migration globally. So that's one definition that I could share with you that I, in a sense, cobbled together from the work I've done. But at the same time, just think about, for those of us in Europe, what is the principal factor of the EU, the European Union, which was first of all called the European Economic Coalition? The primary thing about the EU is freedom of movement. The opportunity to move across borders from one place to another to find the better situation for yourself. Now, they would not consider that if you look at slavery in a similar light. This is why the distinctions matter. And yet when we freely move like this, I'll put that in inverted commas, we always get questions. You know, I was in the Netherlands last year because I have colleagues there. Marvin is one of them, Ferus is another one, and other people that I work with through Padlink, which is registered in the Netherlands, by the way. And I went to Belmar, and I just felt at home there because I have all these black faces and it felt very familiar. Whereas when I live here in Poland, I'm the only black person generally, and the work I did as well. I was like, in a sense, I think to your comment, Lashanda, somewhat similar, is that when I was generally the only black person, and the same thing generally with my education as well. I was only the black person or one of a few black people in the place. And I always had to question myself. I always felt like an imposter, right? And also justify myself. So I felt like an imposter amongst all these white people. And then and I had to justify myself to my black peers who felt that by going to this predominantly white space would actually undermine my black card or my black membership, right? And this is why it's a constant push and pull in terms of at the existential personal level, but then generally as interlocutors in a particular place, because you're never accepted, which is why I asked the question of you, Saskia, at the beginning, do you feel like it's home? Because I don't feel completely home anywhere. Which is why, again, I would say a positive aspect of that means that we are nomadic and itinerant, so we can migrate to different parts of the world and end up deciding we want to go back to Africa, to Ghana, for instance, or to Gambia, or to East Africa, or to West Africa, wherever, where we feel we can find our, in a sense, arbitrary or romanticized home and space, where we feel comfortable, where we feel we could be our full in a sense, sentient being. And that is also something that is connected to hostility towards us, where we're born or where we spend most of our lives. Any comments, questions on this particular point before we move forward? So maybe at this point then, Elizabeth, you can talk about your choice of Ghana and why Ghana, bearing in mind that we have 52 countries in Africa. Why do we feel, why that? Because my parents are Nigerians, and when I go to Nigeria, I just don't feel Nigerian for many reasons, right? And I don't know if it's because of people's perceptions of what Nigeria is supposed to be and this essentialized identity and culture of Nigeria, but I just don't feel it because some of the mores, the cultural practices, the way people perceive or interpret reality just run counter or are counter-ethical or counterfactual to me, like the role of women in African or at least Nigerian society. and the fact that women are considered to be secondary or subservient to men, running through a patriarchal reality, just doesn't resonate with me, because I have a different, inculcation and impulse.
Yes, so thank you for that question. For me, it had to be West Africa because of my roots. We did a DNA test and we found out that we have for 60% African roots, most of it West African roots, also some Nigerian genes. So I always felt drawn to the West African cultures because of that. And then when I started looking out for jobs, I did try other countries as well, but I landed in Ghana, and so it was a pragmatic choice, but also a very much of a deep spiritual ancestral choice. Because when I landed, when I was looking for a job, I'm a journalist by profession, and I wanted to work in the media sector. I tried Sierra Leone. I've been there in 2012. I've tried Liberia. I also thought of Nigeria, but Ghana was really the best place for me to settle and find work that I could do here in the media sector. So I started teaching broadcast journalism in 2014. And so it was a combination of my roots as well as being able to find a job, because I didn't only just want to, stay and find myself a rich man to stay so that I could stay in the country. But yeah, I really also wanted to be occupied with something useful. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, finding a rich man. Yeah, good luck. But yeah, I mean, but again, why would we be flippantly dismissing that statement? This is also a perception that is embedded or deeply embedded in the African mindset, I would say. And I'm not saying, I hate making these generalizations, but sometimes you have to acknowledge that there's certain patterns that are clearly discernible, right? And again, it's this notion that our wealth, our progress as a human being standing in Africa is closely connected to being in the West, right? And I use West as a synonym for white, but it's that reductive actually. So it's something that we need to at least acknowledge in order to counter it, right? So sorry, somebody's making a telephone call. So yeah, anyone else have anything else to say on this matter?
I have I guess exploration of like how DNA tests are being used, like especially people of color, Black people in the West are trying to find their identity and their roots using these tests. And I've done 3, and I've had conflicting results all across the board. I had African ancestry, heritage, 23andMe, and I always get these different conflicting informations. And one particular situation, I found a person that was like my third cousin who was in who was born in Nigeria, never left, and and I feel like these tests brought on more questions than answers, and then it makes me think about the validity of them, and if there's going to be like an actual, and how, if it is that in DNA and science DNA is already out there, why isn't there a more like valid way to like basically put together the pieces for us, right, rather than just and it should be, if it's science and everybody's calculation should come to the same thing, because African ancestry put me at Guinea-Bissau and Sierra Leone, whereas the other tests just say Ghana and Nigeria, which was like the big major ones that everybody keeps saying Ghana, Nigeria, which makes me like wonder if like, is it like, are we really all just coming from Ghana and Nigeria? And then what can really be done with this science to put us together? And even that third cousin, I think he was not a third cousin, he was like fourth or fifth cousin that I found, and I asked him questions like, well, it's saying we share a grandparent, like, would you happen to know who this person is? And he's like, I don't really know, right? And he was born in Nigeria, and he also seems to have the same issue and complex that I have, because he also doesn't know beyond like great grandparents as well.
Yes, sorry about that. Somebody was ringing my doorbell and I'm trying to
No,
get
no,
my
no
friend.
problem.
But I heard what you're saying. I mean, as you were talking, I was just thinking, okay, the other part of the question about what is migration for you is this second part, right? Migration, when did migration start?
Beginning of time, we've always been
Thank you.
moving.
Thank you. That's the key phrase. So when we talk about DNA tests and everything, well, Africa, there's just people were moving in Africa too, right?
Correct.
So, you know, we have that syncretism in Africa. When I go to East Africa, people are telling me, well, you know, the Luo in Kenya, they went from Kenya, from the center of Africa around the Nile to the west because they're going to looking for the coast. Yeah, okay, fine. It's all part of a story that we can't really complete. But what we can say is that we were moving around as people since the beginning of time. And that's again where some kind of tribal conflicts arise. Because, you know, if you think about people moving from the north to the south, especially those who were on the cusp of the green belt, where the end of the Sahara. So we're not even talking about the Moors, you know, but going to Mali, going to West Africa, because, you know, they followed the richness of the land. And if you follow or have studied anthropology in any way, especially African anthropology, you see these migratory patterns, right? The Nilotic people settled around the Nile because it was a rich source of, you know, of sustenance, and they could use it to husband and to farm land. And if you have cattle, you need the water sources and everything. So we were always moving. So it's not a surprise to me that the tests are always going to generate varied responses, right? Because, you know, our blood is so mixed that maybe one day, you know, the salient element of our genealogy will be a particular tribe or a particular country or a particular region. And you got to remember, before the Europeans came and the Berlin conference in 1866, just look at the borders of Africa. There were no borders. We were always moving. And then we were forced to become a people, right? Mm-hmm. So we say Nigeria, but do you know the etymology of Nigeria? Did Nigeria exist before the British came?
Oh no, there was the kingdom. You have your kingdoms and your people.
And so when you look at Nigeria as it's spelled, what other country does it remind you of?
Niger.
Niger. And that's because of the River Niger, right? And so the British, to distinguish Nigeria from Niger, called it the Niger area. And therefore, the Niger area got conflated to Nigeria. But in those two countries, they speak two different languages. The official language in Niger is French. The official language in Nigeria is English. Why? Because of colonialism. Mm-hmm. So you see this partitioning and then the impact of that partitioning and then the generation of a particular national identity that make them as distinctive from one another as they can be. But before these colonizers came, they were intermingling, right? And then it became more of a hostility and an issue around limited resources or access to resources that people were trying to protect. But there was much more, I would say, or greater freedom of movement before the colonizers came and then started to basically, you know, ring fence their own territory of influence and their own spheres of influence.
So, as you're talking, I'm thinking about like how you said the how they limit migration now. I'm thinking about like even like with visas and all these things. Exactly. If you're from the West, then I have more of a better opportunity to go into other areas and explore it and see if I like it. And if I don't like it, go back. Whereas most people in the other areas, they either have to do it in a way that is, you know, not necessarily legal in some cases, and they don't really have the option or the flexibility to go back and forth. So they lose out on years with the family and interacting in their social communities, food, expression, and all of that stuff in order just to express or to express an idea or interest in possibly living someplace. So the migration isn't so free. It's really, I think that's where they come up with the concept of forced migration, because you really can't go back and come back and forth. It's not a free moving migration. It's really, you go and you have to stay here for many years. You know, at least in New York City, I've seen situations where people migrate from the Caribbean, they die here and they never went back. They never saw the grass or the trees of their country where they came from ever again. and they would never see it because they expressed an idea or interest in a place. It didn't work out, and because they were scared to go back, they just kept going through with this, what could be considered a mistake.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of what you say I agree with, and then some of these things I would just like to put caveats to. So, yeah, they don't go back because they, you know, we are in a way, if you just think of our experiences when we go, like those of us who are second generation, who were born in a particular place, and this is, I guess, a lot of us, if not all of us, we become, in a sense, familiarized with that particular space. So going back to Carl Phillips's book, State of Independence, the reason why the scholar guy couldn't go back is because he became anglicized. He was used to the cold weather. It was funny. It was like this, you know, he could wear his overcoat because he became European in that way, right? Actually, because he'd spent so much time away from home. By the time he went home, home had moved. It was no longer the home he had left. And he didn't really identify and fit or comport with it. And that tends to be the case. Like, you know, my mom is a British citizen. She's been in Britain since 1965, okay? But just to show you how mendacious these people are and the way that policies are developed to undermine your legitimacy, look at what happened to the Windrush generation, who were invited in 1957 to help reconstruct Britain, spent generations and decades there, and then being told 5-6 years ago that you're now going to be repatriated back home after spending 60 years in this country. Okay, and so the home, having become that person, which is this syncretic, I don't know, this new form of Britishness or Dutchness or whatever that doesn't really fit with people's perceptions of what British is or what Dutch is, because we look different, right? We're always going to be Black or African or from somewhere else, or migrant or refugee, right? Or former slaves. We're always going to have that moniker or that prefix. So in a way, what tends to happen is that we create a reality that's comfortable for us in those spaces, right? And then in the end, going home becomes much more of a distant dream, actually. And then you do get home and you see that actually, I no longer fit. This is no longer my home. This is no longer the space, because the world has moved on, actually. And we could add a gender perspective, what I mentioned to it, that if you're a man, an African man who came or left Africa in a particular time, like post-independence, early 50s, 60s, late 50s, 60s, and then you go back now, the world is different, you know, because of the influence of, you know, the Western hegemonic notion of identity and education, and that they inform a lot of what we internalize. I said, like earlier, the reason why Saskia's experience resonated because she talked about Eurocentric, right? It's the Eurocentric. And so these values now are translated into the local process and become a thing in itself, right? Because modernity is modernity. And so you go back and then the things that you could take for granted back in the day, you can't. And then you have that tension between tradition, modern, old, new. You have these tensions that push and pull us in different ways, actually. And so in the end, you just stay where you are because it's an evil you know, actually, and you can deal with it because it's been what you've been doing for the past 20, 30 years. So yeah, and so this is why a lot of what you said just now, Lashanda, resonates. But then I know those cases where people just chose not to go back home. They just decided that you know, I'm here, right? And they could take certain things for granted. And I think it was Letitia who talked about, or was it Maureen, who talked about, and I think Saskia mentioned it as well, about just where do you want to be, where you could retire to be more, you know, to have, I think it was you, Saskia, said that you feel like a machine because of working. That's the Western European or the Western way of doing things, actually. And there's this sense that our freedom in terms of choice, it's almost a Marxist or Marxian argument, is out of balance. We're working too much and not enough time to fulfill our human desires and our needs and our mental health, right? You know, because here we are still working until late in the evening because that's the way we've been programmed, and we need to deprogram and decolonize that sense. Whereas in Africa, there's a certain, and it fits in or falls into that racist discourse that we, you know, Africans or Black people are slightly more laconic, and I use that as a euphemism to say lazy, or they don't have the same work ethic, they have poor timing and aren't punctual, you know, all of the negative elements that come or accrue out of us being through migration or forced migration or trafficking. Impacts us subsequently, and it becomes part of our psyche and a part of our pathology, right? You know, it's the chicken and egg thing. And, you know, I don't want to turn it into this super kind of pseudo-scientific or philosophical conversation, but this is similar to what Hegel, the German philosopher, once identified in the history of the philosophy of history, that there's the master-slave narrative, like the Robinson Crusoe concept, right? I'm the master because I think I'm the master. You're the slave because you think you're the slave. And that consciousness, that conscious appreciation makes the system work. So in order to break it, we need to break our consciousness and become slightly more radical and say, you're not my master, right? And start to create that doubt, because there's certain things that people take for granted. And you start critiquing that process and, you know, or reformulating it or reconstituting it. And I think we've had to do that as Black people across the diaspora in order to survive. And that's what the intergenerational resilience looks like. Our parents pass on that form of resilience to us, and then we pass it on to our offsprings, and so it goes on. Any other comments, contributions?
I would like to comment, Larry. Wait a minute. Yeah, because now when we talk about home a lot, we often refer to land, but sometimes there's also like a concept of home when you just talk about the people you feel related to and you belong to, independent of the location of the land where you are, of course. And that's, I think, for me, myself, that's more the concept of home when I talk about home, actually. So it's not anymore really the physical land or locations, but it's, well, in this case, more family, because everybody from my family moved to the city of Amsterdam, where I live. My friends, partner, etc. Everybody is here, and that's why this is home. And if we would pick everybody up, put them in a spaceship, and we went to Mars, that would be home for me also. And I've tried to convince people to go with me together to Africa.
Especially big enough, my brother.
I said, please, let's all leave and go to any place where it's a little bit more, the temperature is more to my likings, but because they stay here, so I'll stay here also, and this is home.
Yeah.
So that's a different way we skipped about talking about home.
Yeah, you know, there's that platitudinous statement, you know, comment in English language called "home is where the heart is," right? So, I mean, look, we can, and that's why I made that reference earlier to Elizabeth's comments about Ghana, that we've got this romanticized notion of what home is and what home represents, actually, where you feel the comfort, the love, the appreciation, where you feel you could be your full self. But then you see, for me, that seems more like a cocoon, right? Is that, so you have that spaceship, but that spaceship isn't allowed to land anywhere, because when you do try to land, you leave the spaceship and you have this hostility, right? Whether it's cold weather, harsh realities, being reminded that you're not from here, even though you are, you know, so that having to deal with that is the thing that I'm talking about, actually, because I've lived in, I've done, through my work as a diplomat, I've been to about 60 countries, 65 countries, and done work in all of these countries, whether short-term, long-term. And I always feel like I'm the alien, even when I go back to London, because the way I see the world through my experience, this consciousness, this cognitive process, is very different to many Londoners, let alone many Black Londoners. So when I come back and people say, so what are you doing today? Where you staying? And I say, Poland. I say, Poland? What are you doing in Poland? It's cold, it's white people, da, da, da. And because it's something that just doesn't resonate with them. It's not part of, the aspiration to be here and to do that. And in a sense, and this kind of feeds back into the latter part, so in the next 20 minutes or so, we'll start talking more around the cultural dynamics of migration and the impact and the influence it has on our choices in life. It's more about the expectations we're being told that we could aspire to as kids when we're growing up. You can't do this, you can do that, you should do that. And then what we see our peers doing, right? So those of you in the Netherlands, do you know the Anne Frank house? Those of you who live in...
Yes, I think we can't escape it if we're in the Netherlands. Yes.
Okay, so I was asked, this is a true story, by the way, right? So I have lots of anecdotes, but this was one that really freaked me out. So I was asked when I was living in Budapest and teaching and doing this consultancy work with governments to help become part of a reference group for the Anne Frank House. We were putting together an animated book for kids to understand anti-Semitism, racism, discrimination. So I was the only black face there, the black person, and I mean, I use that quite facetiously. And I arrived in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam. They took us on the tour of the Anne Frank house, which was okay, cool. And then we sat down and we started looking at the text, and they had this animator who had like this proof. And they had a number of stories of kids in a particular school. One kid was black, one kid was white, one kid was from Morocco, a Muslim kid. I was like, okay, so they're now playing with the stereotypes, okay, because then they reduced it to that, boiled it down to that. And they had this event where at the school, so in the text, they had this event where the kids had to bring something to school to represent their culture. And the animator drew up these scenarios. And the scenario for the black kid was to come to school in a grass skirt and a spear to show he was African heritage. And he was in the school doing a demonstration of how to chuck the spear. When the spear went through a window, landed outside and just missed this old man who was a bigot and a fascist. So the bigot and the fascist started shouting at the school and started racially castigating this kid. And I said, are you serious that you want to put this in school? To talk about black people by using the most unreconstructed stereotype of blackness. And then I asked, so who's the reference? Who's the animator? Oh, a white woman in her early 50s, mid 50s. And I said, okay, do you do any focus group conversation to get content? No, this is her vision. I said, well, this is not going to fly. I'm sorry, because you're just repeating, racist tropes and racist stereotypes. And they couldn't understand why I was so hostile to this. I was deeply offended because, I don't know whether it's the same case in the Netherlands, but in the UK, and I think it's the same in America to some extent, as a racist claim or pejorative, they used to call us spear chuckers, because in Africa, when we have wars, we have spears, they have guns, obviously, right? And I was like, wow, this is the Anne Frank group who have resources, who can do all kinds of things, and here they are. It was just amazing. And as a way of making me feel acclimatized, it was so funny. They took us to the former Jewish ghetto, which was now, I can't remember the part of Amsterdam it is, but I think it's on the outskirts of Belmar, because we went into this housing estate and they had pictures of Clarence Seedorf, Frank Rijkaard, these murals of these Ajax footballers who ended up being superstars and everything. And we were standing in this football pitch and I was like, okay, so why are we here, right? And then they took us onto the main road and they were showing us these plaques. And there's one plaque outside the supermarket. And there's a brother, a black man who was about to walk in and the group was just blocking him. I was at the back of the group, so I just didn't want to be associated with them. And he got pissed off because they were interfering with his daily reality. He had to walk through them, and I was just like, this is some kind of macabre voyeurism, right? And that is why I say, to your point, Kenneth, that yeah, I mean, home is where the heart is, and we can have home in that spaceship, but these are the realities that we have to engage and indulge with. That even the people who claim to be helping us are actually harming us, because we are not the ones involved or dealing with that discourse, right? Because we don't have access to these spaces. We don't have access to those resources. If you and your organization, the volunteer group that you work with, and I with Padlink and all of us put together a project and said that we want to do something about educating our people, our kids, our youth, and then a white-based organization like Anne Frank came along, who do you think they'll give the money to if we're doing fundraising? Right? And I've had these experiences. And again, these are concomitant or corollaries of that whole racist discourse that, again, is underpinned by the racist understanding of migration, that we're illegitimate, which is why we, in a sense, we feel the need to relocate, to find that space, to go back to Africa. In a way, to go back to Africa, again, is like a mythologized understanding of going back, simply because a lot of us have never been to Africa. I have a cousin, same age as me, who's never been to Africa, but he talks about Africa like he's been there and grew up there and, you know, is an African. And I just said that this is just your perception of what Africana is. You have to go there and understand it, feel it, immerse yourself in it, and fully reconnect, simply because the way you're perceived by Africans will be very different to how you perceive Africa, actually. And again, that's one of the consequences of intergenerational patterns of migration. But I, you know, it's something that I think when we're discussing it or contemplating it, we add these nuance or layers of interpretation, because it's not as straightforward as that. Because
Larry, can we go to a 10-minute break?
I was going to do that okay, so before we do then, in a couple of minutes, because then we take a 10-minute break. I also want to offer, as a counterpoint in this conversation, if there are no more comments coming forward, the definition of trafficking, right? Because I think it's quite an important distinction to make. Now, this is a UN definition of trafficking. I've just lost it, just a second. United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime provides us this definition of trafficking. Human trafficking is the trade of humans. So that's the key point here, trade of humans for the purpose of forced labor, sexual slavery, or commercial sexual exploitation. Human trafficking can occur within a country or transnationally. It is distinct from people smuggling, which is characterized by the consent of the person being smuggled. Human trafficking is the recruitment and transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of people through force, fraud, or deception, with the aim of exploiting them for profit. Men, women, and children of all ages and from all backgrounds can become victims of this crime, key phrase, crime, which occurs in every region of the world. Now, these are contemporary definitions of trafficking. And I'll post the link, because I'm using my iPad as my note taker, so I'll post the links to where you can get these definitions, at least in the chat subsequently. So for me, you see a very different definition between trafficking and migration. There's that qualitative difference. The fact that we end up, and we're the ones talking about it, but if you were to talk to slaves at the time and said, what is migration and what is slavery, I think they'll give you a very clear distinction. But because we're now talking centuries later, decades later, and we are looking at it from an academic kind of semi-detached lens, we can fall into these traps of just, in a sense, whitewashing, because in the end, this is what it is. It's a form of whitewashing. Because looking at the definition of trafficking, I think if we were to apply it to slavery, you would see very clearly that it comports, or the way that it just kind of fits. When we say migration, even if we say or preface it with forced, it implies something slightly more benign. And that's the perniciousness of it all. And this is why when we see what's happening in Florida and the way that they're teaching slavery now in America, at least in that state, and it's going to go to all the other states as well, where there's a Trumpian acolyte, or, you know, the white supremacists who just want to dismiss, you know, Black Lives Matters or critical race theory as a form of counter critique. They will start saying this. It's going to take hold, and then before you know it, subsequent generations are not going to know about slavery and the impact of slavery, and the way still today how that particular historical phenomenon has an impact on our realities, which is slightly different to the impact colonialism has, or post-colonialism has, on our realities because of the politicized nature of things, right? So, any questions or comments before we take a break?
I think personally that with time, any like historical event would be diminished over time. Like even with COVID, over the years, you're gonna see that the impact and how seriously we took it. And when we talk about it from a historical standpoint, it's gonna be diminished over time. When you think about like you know, independence of like a lot of the Caribbean islands and them establishing independence, and even in Africa and in Asia, over the generations, the children would, and who would then become adults, would feel like that is more far removed. And the way that we now process information and we get new music and ideas is so quick and fast. We live in a world where everything is quick and fast, and it changes so rapidly that there's not enough time to savor and understand the things that we're experiencing.
Yeah, you're right. But then at the same time, because of that transitory or the transit nature of information, access to information, globalization, it should make this information more readily available, right? That's the paradox of it all. Because back in the day, in order to get this information, we had to go to a specialized bookstore. We had to make the effort. Nowadays, it's at our fingertips. And this is the challenge that we face as subsequent generations of trying to, in a sense, re-energize or to reignite that understanding of Africana, of Blackness and everything with subsequent generations, actually. So, okay, if there are no more comments onto this, then we should take a 10-minute break and be back. What's my time here? At 7:35, so in 10 minutes, okay? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you too.
Hello, is everyone back?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, so are there any questions from the previous session? We touched a lot of things actually, so.
Yeah, I don't really have a question, but more like what you said about what is home for you. And for me, home has always been where I can be myself. And I found myself in different societies, and it's hard to be yourself. You really have to, you know, have the courage to do that.
Mm.
But I did find, like, I did realize that it's not necessarily the place where you find home is as much as, no, let me rephrase it. The place where you find, the place that you call home, the kind of place it is, that is important, but it is also very important to find home in yourself. So for me, it's the connection between my inner self and the environment. And if there is a connection and there is some kind of growth going on, there is some kind of I can expand my thinking, my feeling, even my humanity. If I can feel that I can embrace my humanity, I can expand it. Then it means that there's a energetic exchange going on between the place where I find myself and my inner self. And for me, that has become home. So yes, I agree with you that, you know, I could find a place at home anywhere with this definition, because I know that I need to have an exchange going on between my inner self and the environment where I find myself in. I hope. I don't know how fake this sounds, but this is how I experience it.
Thank you for that, Lisbeth. it's always a symbiotic relationship, right? And that's why when we think of migration and we think of when we think of the historical notions or concepts of colonialism, migration, slavery, trafficking, forced migration, it's always important to look at how that catalyst impacts our lives today, and how it's also internalized by the others around us, right? So I mentioned that I was in Belmar, and I told you I felt at home there when I was there last June, simply because I don't have that experience here in Poland, right? You know, so again, you have a predominantly white environment, the Netherlands, but we have these pockets where we can see ourselves in the faces of other people and understand that they're probably going through the same challenges, the same struggles, the same issues. And that was what, in a sense, creates that sense of solidarity. It's very different when we're in Africa, right? Because, you know, like I said, I was recently in Uganda, and I was also in Addis Ababa for different reasons, but same trip earlier this year. And I was surrounded by Black people who look like me, but we have different histories. And in a way, the way I'm perceived, even though I look like them, I don't sound like them, right? And then they hear this English accent or this London accent, and then they know for sure I'm not one of them. Even though I don't feel the hostility that I feel when I'm in the UK or in other places. And that's, in a sense, what galvanizes us to try and find home when we're there, right? That's the difference, I would say, qualitatively to Africa and other places when we're making this search for where we can consider what is home. So just to give you the anecdote, so I was in Kenya last year, and I'm going back again to Nairobi. I've been going to Kenya now since 2022 because we have projects there working on women's rights issues in some of the ghettos and underprivileged or deprived areas. And the first time I went was in September of 22, just after the elections. And I was walking with my Kenyan colleague who also had dreadlocks. And we were walking down the street, and the security guard, the soldier, saw us and beckoned us over and immediately asked, "Where are you from?" So I just asked the question, why do you assume we're not from here? And he said, "The way you carry yourself." I was like, okay. Now, I carry myself with this sense of defiance. I have like this kind of like attitude when I'm in the street, you know, like, don't step to me, right? Because that's how I can survive in a predominantly white environment that's potentially hostile to me. And so we internalize and embody our resistance, and we project it outwards. So even when we're relaxed at home or amongst our peers, people look like us, we still carry that racist or anti-racist attitude and that approach. And this was before they'd even spoken to us. And when I spoke to him, he said, "Well, we could tell by your accent, you're not from here." So I was right. I said, "Yeah, you guessed it." And they said, "Just the way you carry yourself." And I think that's also something that we look at. Again, that's a distinction really between being considered a migrant, a contemporary form of migrant, to those of us who are born or feel that we have a right to be in that country that we're in. So in the Netherlands, France, UK, Germany, Italy, because we've paid our dues, right? And a lot of migrants and refugees who come, at least to Europe nowadays, feel as if they're there at the behest or the invitation of their host, and I put that in inverted commas, because they're allowing them to stay. And that's, I think, again, an existential difference, or at least a qualitative difference in the existentialism of being perceived and considered a migrant, as opposed to being a citizen because you have birthrights. And therefore you have more confidence in challenging authority, challenging white people, and you don't walk around as if you are with your eyes lowered, you know, in this kind of subservient, subjugated position, which we see. And when I work with refugees, I see it quite often. And also because I don't know, I think they do it still in the Netherlands. I know they don't do it in America, but then you have profiling, right? But here in this part of the world, the police can just stop you and ask you for your ID. Now, if you're considered to be an illegal refugee, migrant, or irregular migrant, you're going to be apprehensive about engaging with authority because they can easily just deport you. And we have cases of people who were stopped in the street by the police who didn't have a legitimate form of identity. Now, under the Geneva Convention, if you can't tell where a person's from, you can't deport them to another country, right? But generally speaking, because they think a lot of Africans, black men, essentially, who come here are from Nigeria, we've had cases of people kind of forced onto a plane and taken back to Nigeria who are not from Nigeria, right? This is the reality. These are the cases that we have to contend with. And that also feeds back into the community about this over-policing, right? And again, the black racism or anti-black racism and pathologies that again justify these these actions and these heavy-handed actions. You know, I know of at least, I don't even know Ferris Subak, but she's a colleague of mine. And she told me a story where she was on the metro, on the tram, and the ticket inspector came on, ignored everybody and came to her and asked her for her ticket. Again, this is what our reality looks like. So when you're in that hostile environment, identifying the place becomes much more difficult, right? So even if we can create that cocoon, and that's why when Kenneth talked about the spaceship, I think it's a great analogy, but I actually say it's like a cocoon because you're kind of ring fencing yourself or sequestering yourself from society writ large, because you always have to prove or justify your existence to these people. It's a different challenge or different situation when you go home. So when I was in Accra last November, I actually did think, I could live here. Coming back to your point, Elizabeth. And I remember my parents, and I have family in Nigeria, but I felt much more attuned to Ghana than I did to Nigeria. Perverse, it's strange, but that's it. And this, everything you said, actually, feeling at one with the place, feeling the energy, you know, engaging with the people, you feel the vibrancy, and it kind of triggers something that's, I would say, innate in us, and that association and affiliation. And I'm currently looking, when I go to Entebbe, Uganda next week, the reason for going is because I'm also looking to relocate at some point to Africa, because a lot of the work that we're going to be doing going forward will be in Africa. And I just, intercontinental travel is just such a hassle. Like I have to go from here to the Netherlands to fly to Uganda. And that's also something that we need to look at in terms of the superstructure, in terms of the world order, in terms of the infrastructure of how we engage economically between Africa, the Caribbean, Americas, Europe, and Asia. You know, when I was in Barbados last year for a conference, I was talking to African delegates who came from all over Africa, and all of them had to transit through Europe or America to go home. There are no direct flights between the Caribbean and Africa, none. And I was trying to just look at the geography. So if you're in Ghana, you have to go to London, Netherlands, New York, somewhere to transit through. Some went to Miami to come to Barbados. But if you're in Ghana and there's a direct flight, you just fly over the Atlantic, right, directly. So again, you see how that racist infrastructure impacts our realities and creates challenges. So this is, again, some of the work that needs to be done. And there's no sense of solidarity between the contemporary youth, and that's a catch-all phrase for anybody younger than me, to understand that our affinities, because that heritage is lost because it's not being taught in the educational system, even in Africa. So when we talk of African solidarity, we don't hear anything around Pan-Africanism with this generation. And I put that on us, right? That we haven't developed those connections and embedded those connections and connected that history or those histories with our contemporaries at home or in Africa.
I was going to ask you, because you mentioned how easily Britain thinks that every person from Africa is from Nigeria, and the African solidarity, because yes, just today they announced that the British Parliament said that they would send all illegal immigrants back to Rwanda. and it doesn't matter where people come from, so Sudan, Mali, it's whatever. So I was wondering, do they also would send illegal immigrants from Syria back to Rwanda? Or is it just because everybody who's African, they will send back to Rwanda, and now the Rwandese government, they have agreed to this statement also. So there is also a lack of solidarity from that government within the whole, with people from other regions. So if they say, yes, send them back, whatever. So those two things, like the solidarity, and also just, I call it stereotyping all Black people at in one image, saying, okay, Rwanda, good enough for you, just go there. Even though they came from, I don't know, Senegal, Mali, Nigeria, whatever. I'm like, I was very much surprised that it went through, and also that the Rwandese government agreed to this policy.
Yeah, the policy has been in place for the last 2 years. So what they have to go through, so the way the system works in the UK is that the government puts forward a policy, then they have to go through what they call the Acts of Parliament, ratification. And there's been
ratified today, they're saying.
Yeah, exactly. So it's been stuck, that bill has been stuck in Parliament because of resistance from the opposition, precisely on your points there, Kenneth, right? Which is, well, first of all, at a legal perspective dimension, it's a violation of the Geneva Convention on Refugee and Asylum Seeking, right? Everyone has the right to seek asylum, somewhat similar to the conversation we're having about being at home, where they feel safe and secure. So what they did with the UK was that they found this third party where they felt that, okay, we can offer you asylum, but we'll offer you in another country that is safe and secure, funded by us. So the government, I think they gave £300 million to the Rwandese, right, over this period of time. So it's like 100 million a year. And then what the Rwandese were going to do were to host them on behalf of the government. So it's like me visiting your home. You're saying, now, Larry, look, I don't have enough food to feed you and your family, so I'm going to send you to Saskia's home. And Saskia will say, okay, I will accept him, but you have to pay for his rent, you have to pay for his food, and you say, okay, I can do that, right? It's a way of discouraging people seeking asylum in the UK. And there's also the fact that a lot of people who do seek asylum in the UK do so because they have family members present on the ground in London or wherever in the UK. So they say they want to go there because they actually have this support network or mechanism in place. So it's a way of disincentivizing people identifying UK as a place to go to. And it's not just the UK, so immigration to Europe has become a noxious, very, very vitriolic process where you can see people dying crossing the Mediterranean from Morocco, Algeria, Libya, Tripoli. It's not a very long stretch, right? Who get into these rickety boats and then try to get to Europe, and then they get there, subsequent who survive, get there and they're being told that they're going to send them back because of Dublin. Dublin 2000, and it's been updated in 2021, I think it was, is this rule, the Dublin Accord, which is this rule that says anybody seeking asylum in Europe has to do so in the first safe country. So if you're migrating from Africa, seeking asylum into Europe, and you land in Italy, you have to stay in Italy and apply for asylum, which puts pressure on Italy because it's really at the southern tip of Europe, of the EU, Spain, Italy, Cyprus, Greece. And so what happens is that these governments refuse to allow these boats to dock. So they're stuck in this no man's land, in these shitty little boats that are not seaworthy, but some of them are rubber dinghies. In some instances, they're rowing boats, right? And if just imagine just the undulating sea, at some point it's going to capsize and people end up drowning. So with Dublin, that makes it much more difficult for people to enter into Europe. And now with the border force enforcing such a draconian policy and in place. So, however, if you end up in the UK, then they say, well, look, we're going to send you back to Rwanda. So, and that's where we are now when we talk about decolonization and post-colonial discourses. We have to look at geopolitics as well, right? Why would Rwanda do this? Well, there's benefit for them because they're getting this money. It's also putting them in a favorable light with the West because of the tenuous situation at home, because there's still tensions between the Hutu and the Tutsis. So one of the things that they do, Kagame is doing, is consolidating his position as the darling of the West. So in a sense, if we were just to boil it down to how we understand, you know, Black folk and reaction and responding to racism, is basically an Uncle Tom doing the bidding of white folk and saying, because just imagine if no African country had accepted, and let's say they sent them to Serbia, we'd be talking about a very racist policy between white people. But African country acquiescing and acceding to these wishes will actually show that there's a benevolence there, right? Because an African country has agreed to do so. So that's also why I made this reference earlier to the mendaciousness of certain things, right? And the perniciousness of certain phenomena, is that in a way, we too are contributing to our own harm. For sure. And that's why it's important to critique and to challenge, because it's going on. And I'm happy to hear that you know about this in the Netherlands, but I can assure you that people in the UK, Black people in the UK, who don't know about this, and if they did, they don't really care, because they don't see how it's affecting or connected to them, right? So it's not even a level of consciousness or subconsciousness or unconsciousness. It's a matter of whether we care about it or not, right? And so a lot of the work we do is to try and raise awareness on these matters, you know, so because it's going on in our midst, but because we're so concentrated on surviving, that we end up not paying attention to what's happening in our name and around us. Lashanda.
Yeah, and what Rwanda's doing, it reminds me also what Kenya's doing, because at one point they had halted like domestic servants to the UAE because they were reports that they were like egregious like human rights violations to the people who they were sending there. But the law was only in place for a couple of months before they dropped it and allowed their people to still continue. And they know the ramifications of sending these women to go as domestics in these other in the UAE countries and how they're being treated. But I guess money talks, so they allow it, right? And then I also think about how Black people, how we talk about migration. And then when I go to places in the Caribbean, I see how white people are able to migrate with such audacity, right? To the point where in Jamaica, all the coastal land is now being owned by white people who migrated there, who are now starting their own business there. Like the most thriving, when you go into certain Caribbean places, the thriving businesses and things that you see there are not owned by locals. They're owned by white people who came to who came there and are not, I don't see them experiencing immigration problems. There's no like big talks of like sending them back to their country. It's like probably very rare that you probably see a white person who is deported from a Caribbean island or an African country unless they commit a crime. And you know, it's even Asians, like Asians are able to come into the Caribbean, migrate no problem. Even in into Africa, there was even an instance where there was this Asian man who came into this area in, I don't know, it was a country, an African country, and what we would see is like these videos of these young kids dancing. We would like and share it, and then when there was like they did a investigative report, found out that this man was keeping these kids out of school, paying the parents like little remittances to keep them out of school, have them dance, or they beat them if they didn't dance. And it took a while before he was even really like things happened and he was deported. He did a lot of damage in that time, right? So these different communities, when they come in, it's never a thing where they come and they add to the communities and they're really a part of it. A lot of the times it's just like they're enjoying the benefits, and nobody is not like the locals aren't hassling them. They don't have to walk around with this armor and protection because they're accepted with open arms in their migration into these places.
Yeah, I mean, and I was going to make a reference to that in this section, actually, but you've touched it there, Lashadna. So we migrate, you know, that's for black folks, so black and colored or brown people. We do migration, we're kind of refugees. When white people do it, it's not considered to be migration, it's expatriation in the sense they become expats, right? And so they're considered in a positive value because they consider, because of the racist discourse, superior. And so they have access to resources and means that will never be provided to us in the inverse or the opposite direction. So my first trip, I mentioned that I've been going to Kenya for the past, well, 2 years now actually, but I've been there like 5 times. And every time I go there, I get angry because I see how Asians, Chinese, and and the Russians basically control the country. They own all the property. If you want to do construction, it's the Chinese. You want to do business, it's the Indians and the Chinese. And then the Russians are just there with their military, they're meddling because of the geopolitical thing, that they need to have the support of Africa and African leadership in the battle against America in this kind of reheated Cold War scenario, right? So you have proxy issues taking place. So the reason I went to Uganda for the very first time, this is the perversity of it all, into 2022. So I went to Kenya, then from there to Kampala. And I've been in contact with a local human rights activist in Entebbe who told me about a story of some of his colleagues who had been imprisoned by Museveni. They were imprisoned because they had conducted a peaceful protest outside of the Russian embassy against the war in Ukraine. And Museveni sent in, or the authorities sent in the heavy police because at the time, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, was there on an official visit. So they're 4 guys with placards. The war against Ukraine is unjust. They sent the heavy-handed, the police, the military police, rounded these guys up, threw them into prison, into maximum prison. And so Mugabe contacted me. I then contacted a couple of lawyers, sent money for representation to try and get them released, and we got them released. So I went to visit this group at the time. And what was quite interesting was when I met this group, I asked why they were protesting against the war in Ukraine. They said, you know, well, blah, blah, it's a humanitarianism, yada, yada, yada. And I said, you do know that Africans in Ukraine who were trying to flee the war experienced the worst kind of racism. They were being taken off boats, taken off buses, taken off trains and being thrown off these modes of transportation and said, you have to walk because these places are for the white Ukrainians. They got to borders and the men were being told to go back and pick up guns to fight. They were being denied access to fundamental rights. And we at Paddling had to intervene, go to the border and argue there in many cases, right? So the way Black people, and when I said I did this work at the organization I used to work with before, the country I'd visited the most out of all the countries at that time was Ukraine. I'd been to Ukraine like 20 times because of the discrimination and hostility towards Muslims, towards Roma, as in the Gypsy community, and towards Africans, right? And so they're the most racist people that I've ever come across. And here you are arguing in Africa for the rights of these people because you don't know your history, you don't know the language, what's taking place. Because if you hear that these people are killing Black people, whilst you're here putting your own welfare on the line to support this same country, you know, and I know Bobby Wine, an entertainer, went to Ukraine to take pictures with Zelensky. And I was just like, are you serious? But everybody's just using it because of the instrumentality of it all. It's a photo shoot and the Russians, it's just crazy because he was using it against Museveni to say, you know, the government shouldn't be supporting Russia in this unjust war, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. And so that explains why Kagame in Rwanda could be considered a puppet of the UK and all these other leaders who are basically aligned to whether it's the aligned West or the non-aligned movement, in a sense with Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, you know, BRICS, B-R-I-C-C-S, which is what the country is, Brazil. Anyway, this economic alliance, which is a counter alliance block to what's happening with the EU. It's just madness. But there's all this politics involved. And in all of this, we talk about migration. Because what is the reason why people are leaving Africa today? And one of the things that we're doing at Paddling is to try and reverse that brain drain. The reason why people are leaving Africa to go through that hazardous journey, to go through everything they go through to get there, and then to go through what they go through when they are there, is because of this mythology that you can get a better life in the West. And that's part of the colonial discourse, right? Because what colonialism did was usurp our understanding and our self-belief. And it goes to what Elizabeth was saying about energies, and why I would say Ghana is different, because of the historical position of Ghana in the Pan-African movement, the independence movement, the solidarity movement with the leadership in Kwame Nkrumah and everybody else, is because the West have basically instilled into us and embedded in those societies this mythology that white people are superior to us. That's it. Not knowing that the superiority that they're alluding to is influenced and has benefited from Black input, right? Technological advancements, cultural advancements, political advancements. We have made these contributions. And I go back to W.E.B. Du Bois and the fact that he said back then, America is absorbing, subconsciously or unconsciously, the fruits and the brilliance of Black folk. Okay, so, and he was alluding to spirituals at the time, which is considered to be an American phenomenon. But that was about the condition of Black slaves looking for a redemptive, or creating this redemptive philosophy and cultural practice, saying that when we get to heaven, there's a better land waiting for us, from this oppression, yada, yada, yada. So when I used to teach cultural studies, I would say, okay, so what is Black culture? Then people would say blah, 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 blah. And I say, so, okay, tell me white culture. And people say blah, blah, blah. And I say, don't you see the similarities right now? Right? Just where you're sitting right now, Lashanda, in Brooklyn, what influences has Brooklyn had on the pop scene? And I say pop scene, meaning the music scene in American history. One of the reasons why I felt New York was a wonderful place and it was home for me was because you had all those different influences creating new realities, creating new forms, right? Actually, but this is considered to be American culture. Because if you take us out of white culture per se, what would their cultures look like? The food. I go anywhere now and I say jollof rice. Even white people understand what jollof rice is, right? But because it's so prominent and it's a dominant thing. Jamaican influences, the Surinamese influence in the Netherlands. You take away that color, that diversity, that kind of spice, what will be left? So this is one of the reasons why, and I see Marvin's come on. He and I had this conversation, I think it was yesterday, when I talked about my thesis when I was at university. This is exactly what I was alluding to in my thesis, but looking at it from a Black and ethnic perspective, to show how we've made these impacts, these contributions, but we're not given the recognition for it. And then in a way, when that recognition comes, it always comes from a white person. And then we have to be thankful and grateful to that white person for excavating that reality, right? That's again, and that's the whole notion of the white savior in a sense. And this is why when you see white people in Africa doing missionary work, I just get like, okay, here again, because it fits into that ideology and into that idiom of how we understand. And again, I say we have to look at the foundational components of that. And we have to look at it through the prism or the lenses of colonialism and slavery. And a lot of what we did was in defiance. So hip hop, which was an African thing, if you look at the origins of hip hop, ended up in America, got transformed slightly, and then became this thing of defiance to white oppression and to white supremacist thinking. And then subsequently, like Foucault tells us with the concept of power, what is opposite becomes the center, because the power structure is transformed to absorb it, and they become the thing in itself. So now you see American culture, all these hip hop artists who were considered to be icons. But back in the day, we were considered to be thugs, hooligans, antithetical, Any other comments on this as we go forward? Okay, so I have a question for you. For where you're standing and where you're sitting or where you are.
Yes, I have a comment.
Okay, who's that?
Can you hear me?
Yes, Saskia. Okay.
Yeah. Yes, I think it's sad to hear what Lashanda is saying, that the whole coastline of Jamaica is in hands of white people and not from not in hands of the local people. And that I'm going to Suriname every year, and that's what I'm always seeing. I was born and raised in Suriname, uh, lived there for 24 years, and now when I'm coming there, it's like I'm treated like a stranger. But I'm still, in my head, I'm still a Surinamese. I live here for the moment. I work here. I love Holland, but I also love Suriname. And you see, it's like they're putting a red carpet for the Brazilians, for the Chinese, for the white people. But you, who were born and raised there, it's like you're being seen like a traitor who has left Suriname. And when you get there on vacation, it's like everybody wants something extra from you, but they don't. It's like they don't like you anymore. But for other people, white, I see a lot of Europeans who are going there, are opening businesses. Chinese people are opening businesses. Brazilians are opening businesses. But when you, like a child of the country, comes back, what I did for 4.5 years, everything that I said, fine, can't we do it another way? Saskia, it's not Holland here. Saskia, this is how we do it. Everything that you want to bring to a next level was being criticized. But when another person says it, then it's like it's being welcomed. And you who are you were a child, you are a child of there. It's like you're not welcome anymore. And I'm going there every year still, but it hurts me every year to see what is going on. And I'm seeing in myself that every time that I'm going there, I'm becoming less critical, because everything that comes out of your mouth is it's not being heard, it's not being appreciated.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. But that's a frustration of all of that we spoke about earlier, right? In the sense that we get the white treatment to some extent because we're considered to be Westerners. And so we're not treated the same. But at the same time, when we come with a critical lens or perspective, we're told that this is the culture here, this is the practice here. It's Africa, come on, you know. So in one of my trips to Kenya, I got trapped in a lift because there was a power cut. So I said, oh, you know what? Our leaders can't even guarantee 24/7 electricity, right? That people just accept it. And then as a consequence of that, actually, I remember talking to a friend in Nigeria. And as I was talking to her, she said, oh, I'm out, because she was out in the streets. And I asked her, what are you doing? She said, there's a power cut, but I'm going to go down the road to charge my phone. I'm like, charge your phone? How are you going to charge your phone when there's no power cut? She said, oh, there's a guy with a generator who's basically charging people to use his generator to charge the phone, right? So they found an economic opportunity in this sad situation. And power cuts are just replete across Africa. And I'm thinking to myself, well, how is that possible? That white people can come to our countries, and I include my country in that, and have a better life than those of us who stayed in the country and contributed towards the country, right? And that's because there's a sense of apathy. And we talk about this all the time. Now, how do we address that apathy? And there's just accepting the status quo because of corruption. It's no coincidence, and I don't know too much about the Caribbean appropriation or expropriation of property, but I see it's a similar pattern in Africa because of the leadership. I actually wrote down, as you were saying this, Saskia, and when you were mentioning Lashanda, the paucity of leadership. That's the reason why, that these people can go to these countries and take our land, the most fertile, the most productive land, actually, and then the locals just have to accept it. And I asked this rhetorical question, can we go to India and own hectares of land that's producing tea and coffee? You know, and that's a rhetorical question because we know we can't. You know, when I was buying my apartment in Budapest, I had to have a Hungarian authenticate me because they have this rule where foreigners cannot buy property in their country without a Hungarian being involved in it. You know, so that's how they protect their land. We don't have those provisions in place in Africa. And that's because of the corruption. And then when you get to the situation where you need to engage with law enforcement, again, because of corruption, justice or access to justice is basically elusive and almost like a fantasy. So, I mean, I was on my way out in Entebbe just now, in February. We have to get down this practice in East Africa because of the Al-Qaeda bombings of 30 years ago, that you cannot drive up directly to the airport without the police checking the car for bombs. So I had to get down. So this guy stopped the car, the taxi, and then looked in. I was about to get out. He said, no, stay where you are. And he said, what are you doing here? I told him, blah, blah, yeah. And he said, so my brother, as soon as you're into the work and you're trying to support our local people, what do you have for me? I'm like, excuse me? What do you have for me? Which is basically code for, yo, give me some money, right? And I said to him, well, I have some advice for you. And then he just said, okay, go, because he could see that I wasn't going to pay him anything. But that's embedded as part of the cultural practice. And like the taxi driver, Tom was saying to me, Jude was saying, oh, you know, this happens all the time. That we have, as locals, we have to give them this money, right? And so here you see a situation where everybody's being forced to survive and to exploit one another. And so in this, we come along with our romanticized notion of solidarity and then say we need to be together, where they understand it at the meta level, but in the day-to-day interactive level, no way. You know, so everybody's on a hustle, which is why when we go, and I'm talking to you, Saskia, even though your camera's not on, I'm looking at your name, we have these challenges where we try to change things and they say, oh, you're so European. Oh, you're so white, you're so this, you're so that. I'm like, hold on a second, the white person can come here and you jump up and down for them. And that's again what neocolonialism looks like, right? And again, where does that come from? The belief that they are superior to us because of these historical antecedents. Like I said, you look at the borders, you look at Africa, look at the map of Africa and look at borders. You have right angles, because they were petitioning the parts to keep, you know, so that they can exploit their own little places, right? You know, just look at the border between Libya and Algeria. It's a straight line because they got a ruler and they said, okay, you can have that piece. Then they indented into another country, and look at Lesotho, which is a country within a country because of the spheres of influence, because the French, the Belgian, the Portuguese, the German, and the British, and the Spanish to some extent, but the Spanish were kept out to a larger extent. We're basically trying to protect their little fiefdoms. And look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, what happened there with the Belgians. Till today, you know, the energy that's generated in Europe is being facilitated by Africa. And that's the perversity of it all. And so there are different levels of that challenge where we have to interface and we have to find that space. And the key for us is awareness and education, because, you know, we can't be going back to these places and be more radicalized or feel more injured by what's going on than those people who are living there day to day. You know, and they're treated in such a dismissive, inhuman fashion by the Indians, by the Chinese, by some of the Russians, who just feel, you know, that they can get away and do stuff with impunity. So you talk about that, the man who had the kids doing songing and dehumanizing them. You know, well, where's the authorities there to protect our children? Not there. You talk about what's happening in the United Arab Emirates and other Middle Eastern countries where you have home helps and people going migrating from East Africa to those countries and everything. And you hear cases of murder, abuse, you know, atrocities. They actually call it a modern form of slavery or form of modern slavery. And yet the governments don't do anything about it because, and I think this is slightly more problematic, when the government, so I know what happened in Kenya, when the government imposed that ban in order to create some kind of moratorium and they could do an investigation, there's a backlash by locals who basically still wanted to go because the conditions at home were so much worse, they were ready to run the risk and the gauntlet because they considered it to be a better reality because they could get access to more money. When your average salary is $100 a month and you've got all these overheads, taking care of children, blah, blah, you know, you run that risk if you're going to get $200, right? Let alone 1,000 that you could send back home, and the remittances that we send from this part of the world or across the diaspora back to Africa, you know. And I recall when I was flying into Nairobi, last year, November, the World Cup was still taking place. And I think I was flying through Doha, which is Qatar. And at the airport, all the workers were black. And when I say all the workers, the security, except from the officials who were dealing with immigration, but the security, the cleaners, the people who do the searching for you, the people in the shops, they were all black. And I was looking around thinking, my God, this is completely sustained by migrant workers, completely. So if you were to remove migrants from the economy would collapse. But at the same time, they're not getting as much money as they would have or should have been getting it wasn't a fair trade or a fair deal. They were being exploited, and they were ready to be exploited because whatever they were getting was better or more sustainable or suitable than what they were getting at home. And that's a challenge also for us, because when we come with this almost utopia understanding of solidarity, decolonization, we need to start at the grassroots to let people understand what this means and the harm we are doing by perpetuating these cultural practices and norms. Because we can talk amongst ourselves and we can have a wonderful conversation. We've been talking for a couple of hours now, and I feel like I'm talking to my peers, I'm talking to people who are like-minded, blah, blah. But if I went to Africa and said, like I do, and I said to people, we need to do this, you'll get one person, but oh God, it's not going to happen, Sha, because oh God this and oh God that, and oh God the police, and you look at yourself and think, okay, so what am I doing here? Then they say, oh God, we can't eat, give us some money. So we've pauperized our people, our leaders. That's why, and because of that, they're ready to go and migrate to these places where they're not really welcome. And so one of the things, like I think I mentioned earlier, is that what we're trying to do at Paddling is to provide opportunity or to find ways of channeling resources from the West, from like-minded Black entrepreneurs, businesses, and investing locally so people can actually stay at home. Because, there's this strip between Kampala and Entebbe, a road, they call the expressway. And it was built by the Chinese to the tune of something like 15 to 20 billion. It's a 40-kilometer strip of road, by the way, right? So it shouldn't cost that much. But there's extra, some extra added taxes added, whatever. And so the deal is that the Ugandan government will pay money and the interest back to the Chinese. They will never, ever be in a position to pay this money off, which means that the Chinese will always have a foothold. And all the construction contracts are going to Chinese people in East Africa and the Horn of Africa, to Chinese, and also in some other parts of that, heartland, in West Africa to some extent, and some other places. So you have this hegemonic relationship between, the global North and the global South. And of course, not to undermine or to discredit the climate issues, but when we talk about issues for people of African descent, you have white folk coming in and saying, no, we need to be focusing on climate change, climate harm, climate or environmental racism. That's not really an argument for them in terms of offsetting the carbon footprint. But who are the people emitting those carbon emissions in the first place? The West. Then they go to Africa to teach us about the harms of plastic, and yet they're dumping the plastic in Africa, right? And then saying that this is what you should focus on. Don't focus on decolonization. Don't focus on reparations. Don't focus on restitution, on the fact that you've taken all of our properties, our cultural artifacts, and put them there. Focus on this because we consider it to be the biggest harm to humanity. Yet people can't eat. If you can't eat, what is the biggest harm to humanity if not that? Because you can't survive, right? But so they managed to shift the agenda or shift the focus to things that they consider to be legitimate, and what we consider to be the most pressing needs are considered to be illegitimate, right? And it goes back again to the notion of legitimacy and illegitimacy as a migrant in a particular place, which is why I think the anti-slavery movement and the reparations movement in America, and now seeping into parts of Europe, is really salient and important, because it's about claiming a legitimate claim to wealth, economic wealth, generated by the blood, sweat, and tears and death of our ancestors, right? Who were trafficked into this reign. They didn't migrate. You know, even if they would like to say to us that this is what, or mythologize it as such, or in a sense, reinvent or revise that historical event.
From, like say, an history perspective, you can say there has been now a global economical order has been created the past 100 years, primarily by force. And within this order, Africa is considered to be at the bottom because it's the most exploited, even from a continent perspective, at this moment. And also there's enough propaganda to keep this white supremacy idea alive. And also propaganda tells people what is a good life. And a good life is often material wealth. And through this propaganda, if we believe it, then of course Africans want to move away from the poverty and escape to where the material wealth can be reached or gotten, and they escape then to Europe, for instance, or in the Americas. So then at some point you have to say, this propaganda, like what is a good life actually, that also has to be broken, because when people escape to the West, they will find out that the good life with material wealth also comes with a lot of racism, depression, and sometimes suicide, because so that is actually not good life that people aspire. So this propaganda, what is a good life, that also has to be changed as saying you can experience really a good life among each other in your land of origin. So you don't have to move to the West, etc. But then the components, what is a good life, that is also under discussion, because I don't see enough propaganda of talk about what is a good life, besides then having material wealth. And therefore everybody considers life in Africa not to be very good, because it's always, for a couple of hundreds of years, brought to poverty, and is now also already always kept in poverty. And changing that status quo actually asks for a revolution. And I did enjoy the poster on top of your head of one of the biggest revolutionaries of the last century. But anyway, that in between there, yes. Yes, yeah, there are other, I think, changing the this hierarchy of I call it well, the economic hierarchy, where Africa is one of the most exploited regions in the world. That is a challenge, especially when you can't escape this poverty line also. And trying to, yeah, so like you said, if somebody earns €5, then doubling it is huge for that person. But for us, it's like, okay, we can easily double it and still keep this whole hierarchy in place. So breaking it, I think we only can do it with a revolution.
So thank you for making the comment about chair. When I have meetings, I always sit in this position to be provocative so that people will understand that, you know, my politics isn't going to be this facile kind of acquiescence to the status quo. But it's interesting that we have, I don't know how to really characterize it, but we have more of a revolutionary zest than our counterparts living on the motherland, right, or on the continent. And that's because we have different influences, we have different experiences. And also, I think when we talk to our counterparts back home in their places, there's a sense of disbelief right? Because they've been brought up, or in a sense, brainwashed, I would say, by leadership and by the white West to acknowledge that, you know, the good life or a better life is always attainable or more readily attainable in the West than it is in Africa. And that's where I consider the paucity of leadership there, that they haven't countered that narrative, because it's been going on now since the breakdown of colonization. And I think it's a different argument, a different discussion when you look at it through the post-slavery lens, because you can see the contribution, direct contribution of Black lives and Black folks in America historically. Through colonialism, we've been hoodwinked into thinking that we're the ones who've benefited from the input or the contribution of white people. They're the ones who've civilized us, right? You got to remember, colonialism was characterized as the 3 C's: Christianity, commercialism, and civilization, right? And that's the mythology of how white folk came into Africa, because they considered to be a civilizing force. They're providing more of a commercial opportunity in terms of, in a sense, organizing this business infrastructure. And then also they brought us Christianity, took us away from believing in these gods, these fake gods, and gave us the one true God, right? And if you look at the role of Christianity in Africa today and the embeddedness of Christianity today, it's just amazing. Now, I'm irreligious. I'm happy for people who are religious, but I actually see, I can't dissociate Christianity from the harm historically that Black people have suffered, right? I think that they're conjoined. Maybe it's been utilized or capitalized on by those who were looking to exploit us, but it's conjoined. And a lot of things have happened in the name of Christianity in Africa that have been violent abuses of us, right? So, again, it's a critical lens. It's not to undermine anybody's faith, but acknowledge that faith in itself has been a concomitant component of our continued abuse and continued exploitation, right? So, but to what you said there, Kenneth, yeah, it's amazing how we still believe that story. I talk about The Wizard of Oz. I don't know if you know the film, and The Wizard of Oz, where the dog opens the curtain, and you know, for me, that's the moment I'm looking for, that revealing, that moment of opening the curtain to show people, yo, it's a scam. It's a game. They're running game on us and everything, and this is why I talk about demystifying. Okay, you know, but then people, when I go to Africa and say this, people say, but you know, you can say that because you're from the West. You went to good universities. And I said, yeah, I did that because, not because they wanted me to, but in defiance of them, right? Any achievement, and I talk about Black brilliance, any achievement that we make as a collective group isn't because the system wanted us to do it. It's not as if the system was geared towards our success and our development. I go back to what Saskia said, self-educated. We had to be the sources of our own information. We had to be the engineers of our own, you know, our own consciousness, because we wanted to find out more than what the white infrastructure was telling us. And I tell people these anecdotes when I do my presentations. And I said to people about my own reality living in London as a kid. I was born in London in the 60s. I was a kid stroke teenager in the 70s. In that period of 0 to 13, if people asked me where I was from, I would never say Nigeria. I'd always say Jamaica. And people would say, but hold on a second, your name is, that's not a Jamaican name. I say, yeah, but I'm Jamaican. I'm Larry. And I continued to perpetuate this lie or this fantasy because I didn't want to be associated with Nigeria. Because at the time, the Biafra War was taking place. And all you saw on television were these images of brutality, people killing each other, and they were all saying Nigerian, Biafran War, Nigerian, all this negativity, which fed into the racist discourse and perception of Nigerians. Okay, like now, today, they see them as Yahoo boys, internet crooks, right? And so, and not just as a Nigerian, because Jamaicans were cool, because there's Bob Marley, there's reggae, you know, blah, blah. So it's a cooler Black identity to align myself with. So I was like, yeah, I'm Jamaican. Then my mom took me home to Nigeria at 13. Boom, big difference. I started to understand about African history. I started to read Chinua Achebe. I started to read our heritage. And then when I came back after 5 years of being immersed in this system, understanding about great empires of Sundiata, Mansa Musa, the kingdoms in Ghana, the Kumasis and the Ashantis, and that history that I'm not getting in England. The history I'm getting in England is about how white people went there, we did this, we civilized them, they were savages, they were barbarians, they were cannibals. I came back with this hatred of white people. And I tell people this, I mean, if Al-Qaeda was around at the time, I'd have probably joined because I was radicalized to the nth degree because I hated the trick they played on me to hate myself, right? But I had to have that moment of epiphany. I had to go through, I mean, I think it was Letitia or Maureen who talked about translate or transitions. We have to do this because there's no sense of our roots in that sense, right? You know, which is why I commend all of you in what you're doing generally, because what brought us together was this lecture or this presentation on migration, actually. But then when we look at what I call them epiphenomena, these issues that are generated out of those big historical moments, actually, you can see how the challenges are so vast, actually, because I don't know whether we are the romantics or the utopian fantasists, right? But do you understand or do you appreciate the fact that what we're calling for isn't just going to happen? The revolution is not going to happen in Africa. It's happened in Mali, it's happened in the coups that have taken place recently, but look at the backlash. You've got Nigeria and the ECOWAS saying that this is illegitimate because of their local histories and their conditions and because of the military, and they understand the threat of the military in Nigeria because Nigeria is a country of coups, right? You know, so this is my point about the exploitation through geopolitics, that a lot of countries in the West are now trying to transform the post-colonial discourse or the post-colonial connections or, you know, dynamic into something more obtuse and more opaque. So now we have Africans fighting Africans on behalf of white folk and their former colonial masters. Look at the apology. I mean, all these my Surinese brothers and sisters here. I know the apologies that the Dutch king and prime minister gave last year was something that wasn't totally accepted because they didn't acknowledge in Suriname the harm of slavery and colonialism, because they were just trying to appease the local political pressure in the Netherlands, and also because of the, apparently, the offshore oil and gas deal that the government, you know, so there's always something behind it. There's nothing pure. In Kenya, the King of England went there to apologize without apologizing because they understand the legal jeopardy that they're in if they were to acknowledge culpability to some extent, because then that opens up claims for compensation. You know, they set up the 200 million fund for slavery in the Netherlands. No, because of these funds, they were not going to. They were so we're doing stuff on behalf of Black folk. I'm sure Anne Frank would have gotten money from that if they applied. You know, but Kenneth and your organization and Maureen and Letitia, if you had applied for project work and everything, you'd have to go through a white conduit. I mean, how perverse is that? That you set something up for us and then you say white people have to be the ones who basically give it to you. You know, there's this thing called the Dutch Civil Alliance, who were, when we were doing this work in here in Poland, helping people of African descent. And there's some people from the Netherlands were donating goods and donating goods and services to us. And the Dutch Civil Association wanted to make a contribution and asked us what we would like. And we said, well, we need resources. We need money to help give people who were going to transit on, who had no money. We needed this. And we had what we needed in terms of basic needs. But people needed documents that needed to be paid for because they didn't have any travel documents to allow them to, you know, to situate themselves. And they said, so, okay, fine. What we're going to do, we're going to give you 2,500 euros. I'm like, for what? They said, oh, for you to buy supplies. And I said, well, we don't need supplies, right? You're not listening to what our need is, right? Then they said, we'll give you this 2,500 euros to buy supplies. And then we're going to come from the Netherlands and buy this stuff with you and then take photographs to post to our website. And I said, no, keep your money. You're not listening to what our needs are, and you're telling us how you, no, keep your money. We don't want you, because for us, this is a form of racism. You don't trust us. So I actually called it black skepticism. When white folk go for money, you just don't ask any questions, you send it. You want to send 2 white people to come and talk to black people and take black people shopping? I'm like, nah, keep your money, actually. And in fact, actually, we're going to put this on our website about our interaction with you. This was a Friday. On the Monday, they contacted us and said, okay, fine, we're going to send you 5K and you can just use it however you want. And I was like, why do we have to go for this? Why do we have to go for this? You said that you're civic-minded. You said that you're humanitarians. Black folk have been excluded from access to the humanitarian needs and aids because of racism. And you're now telling us that you're adding your own layer of racism or another hurdle for us to go through. And this is not just, you know, to them, or only on them, consigned to them. It's basically all our efforts, right? And we knew that they were giving money to everybody. I have a colleague here who runs this, the Somali Foundation, which is the Migrants Help Center, who in Poland set up a GoFundMe program on a Saturday or Friday. And then a week later, he got 400 euros, right? 400 euros, no, 100 euros, 400 zlotys. At the same time, a white-based organization, over the same period, actually from Friday to Monday, got 1.2 million zlotys, which is 300,000 euros over the same period of time. So when we talk about, and I actually said, this is a country that a few months ago, we're talking about Black Lives Matter because of the George Floyd thing. However, when Black Lives really mattered, they voted with their pockets, didn't they? The Black-led organization didn't get anything, got 100 euros in 7 days, whereas a white-led organization got 300,000 euros in 3 days. For me, that was a clear visualization of the challenges that we face, right? You know, so even in a country where there's no history really, or very relatively recent history of migration of Black folk, and this is a proper migration in an itinerant way, they still invoke this racist discourse. It informs their actions. It's almost like a reflex, you know, so.
Exactly. Can I say something?
Yes, sure.
I'm 100% agree. And this is one of the biggest frustration I'm still in, and I'm in it almost 50 years. The reason why I start to say it like this is, you know, when we came here in the 70s, my mom came here in the 60s, they didn't have subsidies and all these things. We did all things by ourselves. And we had our own small businesses. We had our own places that we, buildings, and not only in Amsterdam, but really in whole Holland. So later on, when all the ones get bigger businesses, the government put a system inside. They are very strong power, and divide us with it. They started like, what is the name of it? To bring small business people and organizations together, fuseren, just like a system, you see. But why I'm telling this is because Saskia was telling something very important, and it's not only in Suriname but in the whole world. And I like to address it like this. You know, my frustration is that the colonialistic system is very powerful with a lot of structure or power structures. I want to give one small example, and it starts at the schools. At a school, the HVA, the universities, and the high schools, there is a system that students can go for stage. I don't know if that is a strong English word, internship. And these students, mostly who are going away from Holland to other countries in the world, are white students, because our own children or nephews or nieces are not allowed to go. I have a lot of proof about it, because they don't get a green light. with whatever reasons, but they don't get a green light to go to the countries where they prefer to go, the countries of their parents. That's one part. Secondly, on the school, the government give a lot of subsidy to these high schools and university to go in our country where I am born to coordinate the system and organize another system in the country that I'm born, where these white students are going, with the money that the government gives. So let me give an example. Frederiksdorp in Amsterdam, in Suriname, is one of the places where HVA of Amsterdam got millions to create a new, beautiful, how you say it, werkkamp. I call it a place where slaves were before. And they got this money. They send these white students, and then the third things come. These students had parents or aunties of or other family members who invest in the things that they get there, the grounds and all these things, to buy just grounds just for nothing, for 500 euro, 1,500 euro. And they started to create a business there, the thing that Saskia was telling about. But this is part of the powerful system that this white system create, so that we, first of all, are not there. Secondly, we don't even know that this structure works like this. And third, they don't even have 1 second a human feeling about it. Then only create this powerful structure. So it frustrates me when I'm starting to notice this, started to go to my people and say, listen, right now, this is the system and we have to do something against it. So when I start to talk about it, people are not even listening or don't want to listen. What is the meaning of the system? Because we are not reading this system. We are not in between. So I every moment I'm here in this course, I am addressing this thing. It really frustrates me very well. So it's not only about people who are coming here and of course, and the propaganda, of course, is part of it. But also this thing is a very important point of view to address.
Yeah, I mean, I hear your frustration and your passion because, as you said, you've been doing this for decades now, and it's interesting. Or what's quite interesting to me, when I've been doing this for a few years as well now, and that you just see a repeat. You just see a repeat. Successive generations fall into the same trap, and you're right about the systematized or the systemic nature of things. And that's why we talk about institutional racism when we talk about systemic racism, right? Because it's not just an individual thing. And as you were talking, it was quite interesting because I had a conversation again with my cousin recently about a colleague of his who sent her son at 18 to Africa to do a stagiaire, some kind of internship. And he came back after doing this internship and said he wants to do this work. And I said, so how comes he, as a white 18-year-old, has this opportunity, and you have Black kids who may have a similar, aspiration and ambition, who will never be able to do this because they don't have access to those resources? And that's also the perpetuation of the status quo right there, the institutional perpetuation of the situation. Because when we're growing up, we're not told that we can do this. Okay, so I made the reference to the cultural practices and norms that are embedded in white racist supremacist countries and societies. And I'll illustrate it in this way. When I was a kid, I was good at mathematics at school. So when you talk about mathematics, Kenneth, I admire you. And at the same time, I had a challenge because I was also very good at football and very, very good at cricket. And what happened was that my school, in their infinite wisdom, told me to concentrate on my sporting prowess, because that part of London was generally renowned for sportsmanship. Now, the difference in this, I say this to you, Lashanda, being in America, is that you don't have, at the time, there were no sports scholarships. So you couldn't go to university or to college on a sport scholarship. You could only go on the traditional subjects. So like, you know, sciences and arts and sciences. So at school, I got extra tutelage and coaching for cricket than I did for my academic prowess. Because as a Black person, I was only one in my class who was really good as a Black kid, who was good at maths, as well as other subjects, right? But maths was my standout subject. And through time, I became disinterested because I was spending a lot more time doing the sports. And that's my point about channeling or sequestering us towards a particular activity of the body, a physical thing and not an intellectual thing. And then I don't know if you've heard of the bell curve. You might have heard of it, Lashanda, because of your work. But if you haven't, I can make a reference to it. There's this study about Black and white intelligence conducted in, I think it was 1994. And it was called the bell curve, BELLCURVE, where they had this concave, and at one end was white, and the other end was Black. And they plotted our intellectual capacities and sporting capacities in a sense, in a correlation to our racial genetic capacities, right, or origins. And they showed on one end of the spectrum that Black folk were more physical and therefore physical oriented, so they were more suited to labor and physical work, and the white folk were intellectual. And that explained or justified access to opportunities in the workplace, right? So if you're a Black person who were Black and you have this particular pathology in their heads, the white folk, they'll say, no, 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 no. You are preordained or programmed for physical work. Now, this is what they did. For me, it's in the contemporary form of justification of slavery, because that's what they did to justify slavery. That's where the whole racist taxonomies of race came from and the theories of race came from, is to say that it's about phenotype and it's about physical physiology. It's about science. It's about biology. So we're comporting with our biological predispositions. So we are predisposed as Black folk to bear kids, our women, and to run fast and do all the sporting activities, blah, blah, blah. And the white folk are being told that they are intellectual, they're superior intellectually, they have greater mental strength and work ethic, yada, yada, yada. And this bell curve was a scientific justification or explanation of that. It's spurious and it's been repudiated. But it became a thing in itself, and politicians were using it to show that there's no discrimination. That it's just, the Darwinian notion of natural order and natural selection and everything. I'm writing it down here for you. And so just to come back to my experience, they sent me off to do cricketing. I was a great cricketer. The person who's changed all of that for me was my mum. So there's always got to be somebody in our family histories who are going to repudiate or reject the status quo. So I always had this challenge of doing my homework. And my mum would always insist that before you do any sports, you have to do your homework. And she'd always say, if you cannot do sports, you need to have something that you can fall back on. And at that teenager, I was pushing back because I wanted to do what I wanted to do. That's why I'm talking about the role of our parents and our families, which is why I come back to what Kenneth said about home and the spaceship and everything, because in the midst of all of this hostile environment, as well as this brainwashing or hoodwinking that was taking place with the systemic nature of racism, was this independent little African woman saying to me, no. And that's how I ended up doing what I am today. It's because of her. I'm not a cricketer today, but many of our people have fallen into that trap. And that's why going back to Belmar, I tell you about the murals paying homage to Gullit, Rijkaard, Seedorf, Davids, and everything. That's cool. But this is what is considered to be the iconography of achievement for Black folk and our Black youth. And if it's not that, then it's music. And if you've fallen in with that, what opportunities do you have? Because you have a limited or little or no education, you end up doing what? Criminal activity, because it's, again, part of the pathology. All of this is informed by the racist discourse and underpinned by racism and systemic racism. From even the most banal and benign experiences. Because Mr. Lyons, this guy who was my cricket coach, thought he was doing me a favor. Playing kind of like enhancing or, you know, educating me or raising my awareness to my natural ability. You've got a natural eye. I remember him saying that, a natural eye, and I couldn't quite understand what is a natural eye, because my eye-hand coordination was very good. He didn't say you have a natural propensity for solving algorithms and everything, which is now how people are making money today. So I know with my daughter, I tell her, you can do everything and anything. Don't let people tell you that you can't do something, right? Or that you should do something because you have a natural ability towards it. That is something innate. But that's, you know, one at a time, right? And so why would people listen to our story and our vision if it doesn't resonate? So this is the challenge, because they're bombarded with the imagery on television, in social media, about white supremacy, you know? So, and I see that we have just like about 7 or so minutes left. So I just want to give you this other anecdote, then open the floor to anybody who has something to say. So in 2005, I went to Nigeria to bury my grandmother who passed away. And I hadn't been home for some years. And I was with my older brother, who's the one immediately precedes me. And at the time, there was this huge crisis of oil in Nigeria, actually, which is, again, a perversive, because Nigeria is one of the biggest oil producers. So, but they have no refinery system in Nigeria. So the Dutch, I think Shell is a Dutch company, right? Shell BP. They could extract, so they were the ones extracting the oil. They put the infrastructure in place. But then Nigeria will have to export the oil to the Netherlands for it to be refined and then re-import it to Nigeria as petrol. So who's losing out in this gig? And they've given them all these licenses that basically give them sole license. So there's this situation where about 400 people were killed in one incident because they were piping and tapping the lines, because the pipelines were above ground. And so they were tapping the oil, and somebody lit a match, killed everybody along that stretch. 400 or so people were killed, actually. And so I was talking to my brother, and he said, yeah, you know, if Fela was here, he'd sing a song about this. I said, Fela's not here. You need to rise up, because this is just unacceptable, right? And everything. And it was that mindset that, wow, okay. This is what you see as a solution to the problem, is that you would just write a song or get a singer to sing about it. And then people didn't really see that they had that agency to do something about it. And the other anecdote from that same experience was, as I had a little shitty Sony Ericsson phone at the time, which had a camera and a video. And I was taking a video of my grandmother's, the whole procession, because a funeral, it's probably the same in the Caribbean. When, you know, with the transition, or when people are passing on, they don't consider it to be a sad thing. So there's song and dance and everything, very different to my reality in the UK, where it's very somber and sullen and everything. There are people vibrantly jumping up and down, praising her existence. So I was videoing it. And the guy came up to me and he looked at my phone and said, wow, there's a camera in this phone, like a video? And I said, yeah. He said, oh, wow, white people. The word in Nigeria is, or Yoruba is Onibo. They've gone far. As in, white people are so advanced, right? And I said, yo, white people. And I said, I'm sure a black man made this, right? But you will never hear about it, because we get hidden or submerged in that trope of history of white achievement, right? But that's the whole point, that mythologizing. And it's only recently that we understand that there have been black contributions to the space travel and the space science. And there are contributions to medical science. The first person to do, you know, operation was a black guy, you know, all kinds of things, you know. And once I was repudiating Fela, at the same time, and I tell people that they should listen to, if they listen to Stevie Wonder, there's a song called Black Man on his 1974 album, Songs in the Key of Life, which I think is the best album ever made. And it's just an educational musical accompaniment about black people. And Black Man talks about all the achievements of black men in history, or black people in history, right? And it's just an easy way to get that information across. So when I used to do my work in black communities in the UK, I'd talk about this and play that song at the end of it, so they can hear about what we've done to inspire people to understand that we are not these subservient Black folk who can only, sing, jump, dance, and everything, or become criminals, according to the white racist discourse. Any comments, questions, final words? No, I guess people are tired of listening to me.
Thank you for the intriguing lecture.
No, thank you too. I actually, it's quite seldom and quite rare that I'm talking to people like you, as in Black folk, because generally when I'm doing these lectures, I'm talking to white people who are trying to understand. So, and also at this time of the day. So I appreciate your commitment. And what I'll do is, I said I would also put in the chat. So I'll put pad link.
I do have one comment. When you made mention about that young man who was going, why he had the opportunity to go to Africa and, explore what he would like to do. It reminded me how I think in Israel they do birthright trips for people of Jewish descent. So you get that opportunity, but the government, maybe I don't know, they do have. I don't want to believe that they don't have money or the infrastructure to do these things, because I see also like some of these politicians, they have these big lavish weddings for their children and give out iPhones for gifts, right? So, to establish like whether it be 10 African or 20 African descendants from the West to come into Africa and, provide something like a birthrights trip like they do in Israel would be beneficial to us overall. And then again, this idea about us being in sports and us being able to take pain and stuff like that, this narrative has been very detrimental. Like here in New York, we have like they say 1 in 4 Black women are likely to die in childbirth in New York, right? Because of this idea, sometimes the profession's medical racism, where they think that we could take pain and that we could endure and we have all this strength. But the truth is we're human, and we have the same workings as anybody else. It's just that we've been conditioned. And if you condition the mind enough to make a person think that they are supposed to endure, they'll endure it. But it doesn't mean that there's no price to the endurance of this pain and stress, because eventually it comes up in our bodies as cancer. It comes up as disease. All these things that they said we're more predisposed to, but it's not because, we're any different or special. I think it's because of this stress that we're being put under.
As you're talking, I've written it in the thing. It's mainly for you, Lashanda, but everyone else as well. There's a play called Blue Oranges. Have you heard of it? It's a play about race, the intersection, the nexus between racism and mental health in Black communities. I watched it 20 years ago. And at the time, there was a conversation about how what people consider to be typical or traditional definitions or diagnoses of dementia, when they apply it to Black folk, is overlooking the impact of racism. And so they would take these indicators of short temper. It's basically a way of explaining the angry Black woman phenomenon, right? And saying, it's a form of dementia, because and it was just a way that they overlooked how the impact of racism could manifest itself amongst Black folk to affect their reality. And then, because they were looking at it through a white prism or a white lens, right? What is typical or traditional or normal. Nowadays, like, I guess because here you are in the work you're doing, there's a greater acknowledgement of that. But it's also something that I always tell people that, look, in a way, having psychotherapy or addressing mental health issues in the Black community is considered a luxury, because a lot of people do not have the opportunity or the capacity to engage with a psychotherapist or to undertake remedial therapy to address the issues, because they just can't, right? They're like, to attend a session with a therapist is going to cost a lot of money, and you have to make a choice between whether you want to go to a therapist for a couple of days or put food on the table, right? And so you have to endure all the factors, the shaping, the environmental factors that are impacting or pressuring you into a particular thing. And people say, well, here you are, you're a strong Black woman, you're a strong Black man, yada, 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 yada. And then we believe that mythology, that we don't actually have mental health issues. So, and getting and addressing it, right? So again, that's also part, I would say, of part of the racist taxonomy in terms of how we too internalize that, right? And say it's a sign of weakness if you display that, you know? And so there's this adverse, deleterious impact of addressing or not addressing. You do, then you don't. It's always, that's my point about the ebb and the flow and the push and the pull. That make us, when we negotiate and navigate this, makes it much more difficult, and why we then seek solace elsewhere, where you have less of that, right? So, I mean, if I were to compare my realities in Africa compared to my realities in Europe, and I had to decide where I wanted to be, I'd be Africa. Even if they treat me like the white man, or they, you know, but it's at least you have this benign presence, this benignness that's, you know, shaping that interaction. So, so yeah, but to your point, Saskia, I think, and also Maureen, I feel that what we need to do is continue to do this work in terms of raising awareness amongst our kids and amongst the subsequent generations about the true impact in terms of opportunities being infringed upon or impinged upon by white folk and their perception of us and how we perceive ourselves in relation to that, right? It's the oppositional identity forming process, right? I am Larry because I'm not you. You are white because I am black. I'm a man because you're a woman. Now I know with the fluidity today that everybody are transgressing these norms, but still I would consider that to be, you know, still within the teleology of understanding of identity, right? And how we are always in this symbiotic juxtaposition, challenge, you know, and reaction, you know, not reacting, trying to be black, but then what does that mean? You know, well, what does that mean? We haven't even discussed that, right? You know, what does being black mean in this reality? And in this racist reality. So it's always interesting to see that it's always going to be a state of flux. That's what I consider, I think. And that in a way, we all have our roles to play. And like I said, one of the things that we're doing is trying to provide those opportunities at Padlink through working with others on conducting these, you know, as you say, heritage tours, right? One of the things Marvin and I are discussing through the Bruce Institute is to do exactly that, to, of all places, and I know you know this place, Elizabeth, is to Almina in Ghana, right? Because
Yes,
there's little or no history about it. And when I went there, I was like, all these white people are coming here. There are only a few black folk, and because we were delegates and we were the guests of the president, there's 60 or so of us, or 100 of us. But generally speaking, it's mainly white people, and they were just standing there taking in this history. There's this white guilt writ large and everything. But it's like, hold on a second, you know, they like that door of no return. People were, I mean, I feel emotional thinking about it now, knowing that our ancestors went through that. And we are now the product of that in a way. So mainly more your side than my side. But
but that has changed, Larry. Places like Elmina and Cape Coast Castle, ever since 2019, Ghana has 2019, Ghana has called the year of return, and a lot of people came then. A lot of roots tourists came then.
yeah.
And they basically transformed the whole place. So it's actually now
I'm not talking about that though. I'm talking about the youth. The fact that that history, that experience is not shared amongst the younger generation, right? Because it was people like myself and us who have the means to go there. But I'm saying that it should be part of the infrastructure, the systematic educational system for Black kids to be able to go there. And this is what we're trying to develop as a program with this Ghanaian, this Accra-based organization who are effectively trying to develop, if not the physical experience, the virtual experience, by putting together something that can be shared in schools across the diaspora. So I'm not just talking. Sorry?
It is actually a very common place for school children to go to. So
in Europe.
No, I'm talking about Ghanaian school
No,
children.
no, I'm talking about the diaspora. That's my point. So Europe, right?
Okay.
So
Yeah.
the diaspora. So, and you say Ghanaian students, but again, there are other children outside of Ghana who should be exposed to this as well, right? You know, across the continent. So what we're trying to do is establish that particular pathway. And so we do, like when I was talking about reparations in Uganda, I was talking about these experiences there actually. And even though people, again, I was talking to like-minded people, were intellectually aware of it, I still felt that the human experience is very important because it's very tangible. You know, because again, I'm trying to talk about the impact of the West on Africa and the impact of the West for us in the West. And so this is why the Bruce Institute, as in Marvin and I had that conversation with Reform Initiative, the Ghanaian-based organization, where we're trying to put together this program and then seek funding from somebody like the Open Society Fund to do it through their global justice initiative, which is basically who we work with on the reparations mandate that we have. Yeah, on that somber note. Any other comments?
Yeah, well, anyway, I think I want to really thank you for this lecture for today. And I just looked up www.petlink.org, and I saw also the message about connectivity between the African diaspora.
Yeah.
So I think it's very important, the connectivity part. So I would like to end on a good note, because what we will build are so many different spaceships where everybody can feel home, and all these spaceships are interconnected. So you have so many safe spaces where we can be ourselves, and being ourselves in this type of environment is truly a revolutionary act. So we'll do that.
Well, again, thank you all for your time and also for your efforts. And yeah, I hope you do stay in touch. I'll give you my email address. But I do know that Marvin and the Bruce Institute and I are working on some other programs. So I'm hoping that our paths come across each other. And you could always reach out, and we can communicate. There are many things. I want to build up this alliance where we make contributions. So I feel that if we stay in touch, we could all make that contribution together. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much also.
Elizabeth?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Larry, for this talk, and I hope you will come again.
Well, I hope so too. And also we might be inviting you to some of our events, because we do similar events as well, but not lectures, but presentations and commemorative events. And for those of you in Amsterdam, I will be there quite soon. So hopefully we could all end up and have some jollof rice in.
Yes, let us know, please.
Okay, let us know. Thank you.
Yes.
Let us
Well,
know.
Marvin will know. If you know Marvin, then you know that.
Thank you.
Okay, good one. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay? Take care and keep up the good work.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Moesten we niet langer blijven voor iemand van het Broos Instituut?
Nee, dat komt vrijdag. Dat hebben ze verplaatst naar vrijdag.
Oh,
Dr. Nimo er ook bij en Marvin is er dan ook bij.
oké.
Ja.
Oké.
En dat is binnen de 3 uur.
Oké, goedenavond.
Oké, goedenavond. Doei. Ik ga stoken.